Chapter 25 of Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Grant plans the spring campaigns. The President's son joins Grant's staff. Lee asks a personal interview. A visionary peace program. High prices in Richmond. Grant receives a medal from Congress. Shaving under difficulties. Arrival of Sheridan's scouts. General Grant was at this time employing all his energies in maturing his plans for a comprehensive campaign on the part of all the armies, with a view to ending the war in the early spring. Sheridan was to move down the Valley of Virginia for the purpose of destroying the railroads, the James River Canal, and the factories in that section of country used for the production of munitions of war. Stoneman was to start upon a raid from East Tennessee with 4,000 men, with a view to breaking up the enemy's communications in that direction. Canby, who was in command at New Orleans, was to advance against Mobile, Montgomery, and Selma. In the movement on Mobile, Canby had at least 45,000 men. Thomas was to send a large body of cavalry under Wilson into Alabama. The movements of our forces in the West were intended not only to destroy communications, but to keep the Confederate troops there from being sent east to operate against Sherman. Sherman was to march to Columbia, South Carolina, thence to Fayetteville, North Carolina, and afterward in the direction of Goldsboro. Schofield was to be transferred from Tennessee to Annapolis, Maryland, and thence by steamer to the Cape Fear River for the purpose of moving inland from there and joining Sherman in North Carolina. Schofield's orders were afterward changed, and he rendezvoused at Alexandria, Virginia, instead of Annapolis. The Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James were to watch Lee, and at the proper time strike his army a crushing blow, or, if he should suddenly retreat, to pursue him and inflict upon him all damage possible, and to endeavor to head off and prevent any portion of his army from reaching North Carolina as an organized force capable of forming a junction with Johnston and opposing Sherman. Some of these operations were delayed longer than was expected, and a few changes were made in the original plan, but they were all carried into effect with entire success, and the military ability of the General-in-Chief never appeared to better advantage than in directing these masterly movements, which covered a theater of war greater than that of any campaigns in modern history, and which required a grasp and comprehension which have rarely been possessed even by the greatest commanders. He was at this period indefatigable in his labors, and he once wrote in a single day 42 important dispatches with his own hand. In the latter part of January, General Grant went with Schofield down the coast and remained there a short time to give personal directions on the ground. Sherman entered Columbia February 17, and the garrison of Charleston evacuated that place on the 18th without waiting to be attacked. When this news was received, Dr. Craven, a medical officer who was in the habit of drawing all his similes from his own profession, commended the movement by saying, "General Sherman applied a remedial agency which is in entire accord with the best medical practice." Charleston was suffering from the disease known as secession, and he got control of it by means of counter-irritation. Wilmington was captured on the 22nd of February. An addition was now made to our staff in the person of Captain Robert T. Lincoln, the President's eldest son. He had been graduated at Harvard University in 1864 and had at once urged his father to let him enter the Army and go to the front. But Mr. Lincoln felt that this would only add to his own personal anxieties, and Robert was persuaded to remain at Harvard and take a course of study in the law school. The fact is not generally known that Mr. Lincoln already had a personal representative in the Army. He had procured a man to enlist early in the war, whom he always referred to as his substitute. This soldier served in the field to the end with a good record, and the President watched his course with great interest and took no little pride in him. In the spring of 1865, Robert renewed his request to his father, who mentioned the subject to General Grant. The General said to the President that if he would let Robert join the staff at headquarters, he would be glad to give him a chance to see some active service in the field. The President replied that he would consent to this upon one condition, that his son should serve as a volunteer aide without pay or emoluments. But Grant dissuaded him from adhering to that determination, saying that it was due to the young man that he should be regularly commissioned and put on an equal footing with other officers of the same grade. So it was finally settled that Robert should receive the rank of captain and assistant adjutant general, and on February 23 he was attached to the staff of the general-in-chief. The new acquisition to the company at headquarters soon became exceedingly popular. He had inherited many of the genial traits of his father, and entered heartily into all the social pastimes at headquarters. He was always ready to perform his share of hard work, and never expected to be treated differently from any other officer on account of his being the son of the chief executive of the nation. The experience acquired by him in the field did much to fit him for the position of Secretary of War, which he afterward held. This month had brought me another promotion. I received a commission as brevet colonel of volunteers, dated February 24, for faithful and meritorious services. On the evening of March 3, just as the general was starting to the mess hut for dinner, a communication was handed to him from General Lee, which had come through our lines and was dated the day before. After referring to a recent meeting under a flag of truce between Ord and Longstreet, from which the impression was derived that General Grant would not refuse to see him if he had authority to act for the purpose of attempting to bring about an adjustment of the present difficulties by means of a military convention, the letter went on to say, "Sincerely desiring to leave nothing untried which may put an end to the calamities of war, I propose to meet you at such convenient time and place as you may designate, with the hope that upon an interchange of views it may be found practicable to submit the subjects of controversy between the belligerents to a convention of the kind mentioned. In such event I am authorized to do whatever the result of the proposed interview may render necessary or advisable." There came enclosed with this letter another, stating that General Lee feared there was some misunderstanding about the exchange of political prisoners, and saying that he hoped that at the interview proposed some satisfactory solution of that matter might be arrived at. General Grant, not being vested with any authority whatever to treat for peace, at once telegraphed the contents of the communication to the Secretary of War and asked for instructions. The dispatch was submitted to Mr. Lincoln at the Capitol, where he had gone, according to the usual custom at the closing hours of the session of Congress, in order to act promptly upon bills presented to him. He consulted with the Secretaries of State and War, and then wrote with his own hand a reply, dated midnight, which was signed by Stanton and forwarded to General Grant. It was received the morning of the 4th and read as follows: "The President directs me to say to you that he wishes you to have no conference with General Lee unless it be for the capitulation of General Lee's army or on some minor and purely military matter. He instructs me to say that you are not to decide, discuss, or confer upon any political question. Such questions the President holds in his own hands and will submit them to no military conferences or conventions. Meantime, you are to press to the utmost your military advantages." The General thought that the President was unduly anxious about the manner in which the affair would be treated, and replied at once, "I can assure you that no act of the enemy will prevent me from pressing all advantages gained to the utmost of my ability. Neither will I, under any circumstances, exceed my authority or in any way embarrass the government. It was because I had no right to meet General Lee on the subject proposed by him that I referred the matter for instructions." He then replied to Lee, "In regard to meeting you on the 6th instant, I would state that I have no authority to accede to your proposition for a conference on the subject proposed. Such authority is vested in the President of the United States alone. General Ord could only have meant that I would not refuse an interview on any subject on which I have a right to act, which of course would be such as are purely of a military character, and on the subject of exchanges which has been entrusted to me." It was learned afterward that an interesting but rather fanciful program had been laid out by the enemy as a means to be used in restoring peace, and that this contemplated interview between Grant and Lee was to be the opening feature. Jefferson Davis had lost the confidence of his people to such an extent as a director of military movements that Lee had been made generalissimo and given almost dictatorial powers as to war measures. As the civilians had failed to bring about peace, it was resolved to put Lee forward in an effort to secure it upon some terms which the South could accept without too great a sacrifice of its dignity by means of negotiations which were to begin by a personal interview with General Grant. One proposition discussed was that after the meeting of Grant and Lee, at which peace should be urged upon terms of granting amnesty, making some compensation for the emancipated slaves, etc., by the national government, it should be arranged to have Mrs. Longstreet, who had been an old friend of Mrs. Grant, visit her at City Point, and after that to try and induce Mrs. Grant to visit Richmond. It was taken for granted that the natural chivalry of the soldiers would assure such cordial and enthusiastic greetings to these ladies that it would arouse a general sentiment of goodwill, which would everywhere lead to demonstrations in favor of peace between the two sections of the country. General Longstreet says that the project went so far that Mrs. Longstreet, who was at Lynchburg, was telegraphed to come on to Richmond. The plan outlined in this order of procedure was so visionary that it seems strange that it could ever have been seriously discussed by anyone. But it must be remembered that the condition of the Confederacy was then desperate, and that drowning men catch at straws. It was seen that Grant, by his operations, was rapidly forcing the fight to a finish. The last white man in the South had been put into the ranks, the communications were broken, the supplies were irregular, Confederate money was at a fabulous discount, and hope had given place to despair. The next evening one of our scouts returned from a trip to Richmond and was brought to headquarters in order that the General-in-Chief might question him in person. The man said, "The depreciation in the purchasing power of graybacks, as we call the rebel treasury notes, is so rapid that every time I go into the enemy's lines I have to increase my supply of them. On my last trip I had to stuff my clothes full of their currency to keep myself going for even a couple of days. A barrel of flour in Richmond now costs over $1,000, and a suit of clothes about $1,200. $1 in gold is equal in value to $100 in graybacks. Then so much counterfeit Confederate money has been shoved in through our lines that in the country places they don't pretend to make any difference between good and bad money. A fellow that had come in from the western part of the state told me a pretty tough yarn about matters out there. He said everything that has a picture on it goes for money. If you stop at a hotel and the bill of fare happens to have an engraving of the house printed at the top, you can just tear off the picture and pay for your dinner with it." On the 10th of March, the Honorable Elihu B. Washburn, who had paid one or two visits before to headquarters, arrived at City Point and brought with him the medal which had been struck in accordance with an act of Congress in recognition of General Grant's services, of which Mr. Washburn had been commissioned to present. A dozen prominent ladies and gentlemen from Washington came at the same time. On the afternoon of the next day, General Grant went with them to the lines of the Army of the Potomac and gave orders for a review of some of the troops. That evening some simple arrangements were made for the presentation of the medal, which took place at 8 p.m. in the main cabin of the steamer which had brought the visitors and which was lying at the City Point wharf. General Meade suggested that he and the corps commanders would like to witness the ceremony, and in response to an invitation they came to City Point for the purpose, accompanied by a large number of their staff officers. Mr. Washburn arose at the appointed hour, and after delivering an exceedingly graceful speech, eulogistic of the illustrious services for which Congress had awarded this testimonial of the nation's gratitude and appreciation, he took the medal from the handsome morocco case in which it was enclosed and handed it to the General-in-Chief. The general, who had remained standing during the presentation speech, with his right hand clasping the lapel of his coat, received the medal and expressed his appreciation of the gift in a few well-chosen words, but uttered with such modesty of manner and in so low a tone of voice that they were scarcely audible. A military band was in attendance, and at the suggestion of Mrs. Grant, a dance was now improvised. The officers soon selected their partners from among the ladies present, and the evening's entertainment was continued to a late hour. The general was urged to indulge in a waltz, but from this he begged off. However, he finally agreed to compromise the matter by dancing a square dance. He went through the cotillion, not as gracefully as some of the beaux among the younger officers present, but did his part exceedingly well, barring the impossibility of his being able to keep exact time with the music. He did not consider dancing his forte, and in after life seldom indulged in that form of amusement, unless upon some occasion when he attended a ball given in his honor. In such case he felt that he had to take part in the opening dance, to avoid appearing impolite or unappreciative. Mr. Washburne was assigned quarters in camp next to General Grant. The next day was Sunday. The congressman was the first one up, and when he went to shave he found there was no looking-glass in his quarters, so he stepped across to the general's office in his shirt-sleeves, and finding a glass there, proceeded to lather his face and prepare for the delicate operation of removing his beard. Just as he had taken hold of his nose with his left thumb and forefinger, which he had converted into a sort of clothespin for the occasion, and had scraped a wide swath down his right cheek with the razor, the front door of the hut was suddenly burst open, and a young woman rushed in, fell on her knees at his feet, and cried, "Save him! Oh, save him! He's my husband!" The distinguished member of Congress was so startled by the sudden apparition that it was with difficulty that he avoided disfiguring his face with a large gash. He turned to the intruder and said, "What's all this about your husband? Come, get up, I don't understand you." "Oh, General, for God's sake, do save my husband," continued the woman. "Why, my good woman, I'm not General Grant," the congressman insisted. "Yes, you are. They told me this was your room. Oh, save him, General. They're to shoot him this very day for desertion if you don't stop them." Mr. Washburne now began to take in the situation, and led the woman to a seat and tried to comfort her, while she began to tell how her young husband had been led, through his fondness for her, to desert in order to go home and see her, and how he had been captured and court-martialed and was to be executed that day, and how she had heard of it only in time to reach headquarters that morning to plead for his life. By this time the general was up, and hearing from his sleeping apartment an excited conversation in the front room, dressed hurriedly and stepped upon the scene in time to hear the burden of the woman's story. The spectacle presented partook decidedly of the serio-comic. The dignified member of Congress was standing in his shirt-sleeves in front of the pleading woman, his face covered with lather except the swath which had been made down his right cheek. The razor was uplifted in his hand, and the tears were starting out of his eyes as his sympathies began to be worked upon. The woman was screaming and gesticulating frantically, and was almost hysterical with grief. I appeared at the front door about the same time that the general entered from the rear, and it was hard to tell whether one ought to laugh or cry at the sight presented. The general now took a hand in the matter, convinced the woman that he was the commanding general, assured her that he would take steps at once to have her husband reprieved and pardoned, and sent her away rejoicing. His interposition saved the man's life just in the nick of time. He cracked many a joke with Mr. Washburne afterward about the figure he cut on the morning of the occurrence. Sheridan had started out from Winchester on the 27th of February with nearly 10,000 cavalry. On March 5, news was received that he had struck Early's forces between Staunton and Charlottesville and crushed his entire command, compelling Early and other officers to take refuge in houses and in the woods. For some time thereafter, only contradictory reports were heard from Sheridan through the Richmond papers which came into our hands, and as he was in the heart of the enemy's country and direct communication was cut off, it was difficult to ascertain the facts. General Grant felt no apprehension as to the result of Sheridan's movements, but was anxious to get definite reports. On Sunday evening, March 12, the members of the mess sat down to dinner about dark. Mrs. Grant and Mrs. Rawlins, who was also visiting headquarters, were at the table. Toward the end of the meal, the conversation turned upon Sheridan, and all present expressed the hope that we might soon hear something from him in regard to the progress of his movements. Just then a colored waiter stepped rapidly into the mess room and said to the general, "Thar's a man outside that say he want to see you right away, and he don't appear to want to see nobody else." "What kind of a looking man is he?" asked the general. "Why," said the servant, "he's the most dreadful looking bein' I ever laid eyes on. He appears to me like he was an outcast." With the general's consent, I left the table and went to see who the person was. I found a man outside who was about to sink to the ground from exhaustion, and who had scarcely strength enough to reply to my questions. He had on a pair of soldier's trousers 3 or 4 inches too short, and a blouse 3 sizes too large. He was without a hat, and his appearance was grotesque in the extreme. With him was another man in about the same condition. After giving them some whiskey, they gathered strength enough to state that they were scouts sent by Sheridan from Columbia on the James River, had passed through the enemy's line, bringing with them a long and important dispatch from their commander, had ridden hard for 2 days, and had had a particularly rough experience in getting through to our lines. Their names were J. A. Campbell and A. H. Rowland, Jr. As Campbell had the dispatch in his possession, I told him to step into the mess room with me and hand it to the general in person, so as to comply literally with his instructions, knowing the general's anxiety to have the news at once. The message was written on tissue paper and enclosed in a ball of tinfoil which the scout had carried in his mouth. The general glanced over it and then read it aloud to the party at the dinner table. It consisted of about 3 pages and gave a vivid account of Sheridan's successful march and the irreparable damage he had inflicted upon the enemy's communications, saying that he had captured 28 pieces of artillery, destroyed many wills and factories, the James River Canal for a distance of 15 miles, and the bridges on the Rivanna River, and stating that he was going to destroy the canal still further the next day, and then move on the Central and the Fredericksburg railroads, tear them up, and afterward march to White House, where he would like to have forage and rations sent him, and notifying the general that his purpose, unless otherwise ordered, was then to join the Army of the Potomac. The general proceeded to interrogate Campbell, but the ladies, who had now become intensely interested in the scout, also began to ply him with questions which were directed at him so thick and fast that he soon found himself in the situation of the outstretched human figure in the almanac, fired at with arrows from every sign of the zodiac. The general soon rose from his seat and said good-naturedly, "Well, I will never get the information I want from this scout as long as you ladies have him under cross-examination, and I think I had better take him over to my quarters and see if I cannot have him to myself for a little while." By this time the dinner party was pretty well broken up, and by direction of the general, several members of the staff accompanied him and the scouts to the general's quarters. It was learned from them that Sheridan, deeming it very important to get a dispatch through to headquarters, selected 2 parties, consisting each of 2 scouts. To each party was given a copy of the dispatch, and each was left to select his own route. Campbell and Rowland started on horseback from Columbia on the evening of the 10th, following the roads on the north side of Richmond. They were twice overhauled by parties of the enemy, but they represented themselves as belonging to Imboden's cavalry, and being in Confederate uniforms and skilled in the Southern dialect, they escaped without detection. When they approached the Chickahominy, they were met by 2 men and a boy, with whom they fell into conversation, and were told by them that they had better not cross the river, as there were Yankee troops on the other side. Before the scouts were out of earshot, they heard one of the men say to the other, "I believe those fellows are damned Yankees," and soon they found that the alarm had been given, and the Confederate cavalry was pursuing them. They rode forward to the Chickahominy as rapidly as they could proceed in the jaded condition of their horses, and when they reached the stream they took off everything except their undershirts, tied their clothes on the pommels of their saddles, and swam their horses across the river. Campbell had taken the roll of tinfoil which contained the dispatch from the lining of his boot and put it in his mouth. On the other side of the stream they found a steep, muddy bank and a row of piles. As the horses could not struggle out, the men abandoned them and got into a canoe which providentially happened to be floating past, and by this means got ashore. The Confederates by this time had opened fire on them from the opposite bank. The scouts made their way on foot for 11 miles in their almost naked condition to Harrison's Landing on the James River, where they met a detachment of our troops. The soldiers supplied them with trousers and blouses such as they could spare, and took them by boat to City Point. They had ridden 145 miles without sleep and with but little food. The second pair of scouts sent by Sheridan made their way by canal and on foot to the south of Richmond. After 6 unsuccessful attempts to get across the lines, one of them reached headquarters several days later. The scouts were given a meal of the best food of which the headquarters mess could boast, and put into a comfortable hut where they lost no time in making up for lost sleep. The next day General Grant made all preparation for sending supplies and troops to meet Sheridan at White House. The general complimented the scouts warmly upon their success, directed that they should be supplied with 2 good horses and an outfit of clothing, and sent them round to White House with a steamer to await Sheridan there. But on their arrival they could not restrain their spirit of adventure, and rode out through the enemy's country in the direction of the South Anna River until they met their commander. Campbell was only 19 years of age. Sheridan always addressed him as "boy," and the history of his many hair-breadth escapes that year would fill a volume. Campbell has always remained a scout, and is still in the employ of the government in that capacity at Fort Custer. Rowland is now a prominent lawyer in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This day, March 13, possesses a peculiar personal interest for me, for the reason that it is the date borne by 2 brevet appointments I received, one of colonel and the other of brigadier general in the regular army, for gallant and meritorious services in the field during the rebellion. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Grant draws the net tighter around the enemy. President Lincoln's last visit to Grant. Grant's foresight. Attack on Fort Stedman. The President tells some anecdotes. Mr. Lincoln's kindness to animals. Sheridan's final orders. The President reviews the Army of the James. Sheridan reached White House on March 19 after having made a campaign seldom equaled in activity through a difficult country and during incessant rains. He had whipped the enemy at all points, captured 17 pieces of artillery and 1,600 prisoners, and destroyed 56 canal locks, 5 aqueducts, 23 railroad bridges, 40 canal and road bridges, together with 40 miles of railroad, numerous warehouses and factories, and vast quantities of military supplies. On March 20, Stoneman advanced toward East Tennessee, and on the same day Canby moved his forces against Mobile. Sherman had whipped all the troops opposed to him in his march through the Carolinas and destroyed communications in all directions. He and Schofield met with their armies at Goldsboro, North Carolina, on the 23rd of March, and about all the points on the Atlantic coast were now in our possession. When Sheridan started to join Grant, Hancock had been put in command of the Middle Military Division. The various armies were all working successfully with a common purpose in view, and under one watchful guiding mind, the web was being woven closer and closer about the Confederate capital, and the cause of secession was every day drawing nearer to its doom. General Grant's only anxiety now was to prevent the escape of the enemy from Richmond before he could be struck a crushing blow. No campaign in force could be made at this time by moving around to the west of Lee's army and heading it off in that direction, for the reason that the rainy season still continued and rendered the roads difficult for infantry and impassable for wagons and artillery, and because Sheridan's cavalry had not yet joined our army in front of Petersburg. Every possible precaution was taken meanwhile to prevent Lee from withdrawing his army. Scouts and spies were more active than ever before. About 30,000 men were kept virtually on the picket line, and all the troops were equipped and supplied, ready to make a forced march at a moment's notice in case Lee should be found moving. It was now ascertained that Sheridan could start from White House on March 25 to join the Army of the Potomac, and on the 24th orders were issued for a general movement of the armies operating against Petersburg and Richmond to begin on the night of the 28th for the purpose of marching around Lee's right, breaking up his last remaining railroads, the Danville and the South Side, and giving, if possible, the final blow to the Confederacy. On March 20, General Grant had telegraphed the President, "Can you not visit City Point for a day or two? I would like very much to see you, and I think the rest would do you good." This invitation was promptly accepted, and on the 24th word came that he was on his way up the James aboard the River Queen. About 9 o'clock that evening the steamer approached the wharf, and General Grant, with those of us who were with him at the moment, including Robert Lincoln, went down to the landing and met the President, Mrs. Lincoln, and their youngest son, Tad, and several ladies who had come from Washington with the presidential party. The meeting was very cordial. It lasted but a short time, however, as Mr. Lincoln and his family were evidently fatigued by the trip, and it was thought that they might want to retire at an early hour. His steamer was escorted by a naval vessel named the Bat, commanded by Captain John S. Barnes, an accomplished officer of the Navy. Grant, with his usual foresight, had predicted that Lee would make a determined assault at some point on our lines in an endeavor to throw our troops into confusion and then make his escape before our men could recover from their consternation and be prepared to follow him closely. As early as February 22, the General-in-Chief sent a very characteristic dispatch to Parke, who was temporarily in command of the Army of the Potomac during Meade's absence. As there is a possibility of an attack from the enemy at any time, and especially an attempt to break your center, extra vigilance should be kept up both by the pickets and the troops on the line. Let commanders understand that no time is to be lost awaiting orders if an attack is made, in bringing all their resources to the point of danger. With proper alacrity in this respect, I would have no objection to seeing the enemy get through. On the evening of the 24th of March, General Meade came to headquarters to meet Mrs. Meade, who had arrived by steamer at City Point, and General Grant suggested to him that he had better remain over till the next day, which he did. General Ord also stayed at headquarters that night. About 6 o'clock the next morning, March 25, the camp was awakened and was soon all astir by reason of a message from the Petersburg front saying that the enemy had broken through our lines near Fort Stedman and was making a heavy attack. Soon after, it was found that the telegraph line had been broken, and as messages would now have to come most of the distance by couriers, there was increased anxiety as to the movement. General Grant saw at once that his prediction of a month before had been fulfilled, but believed that the cautions given would be observed, so that he did not experience much apprehension. We had wakened him the moment the announcement came by rapping upon the door of the room occupied by him and Mrs. Grant, and in reply to his question the dispatch was read aloud enough for him to hear it without opening the door. He dressed at once, and as this was a process which never occupied many minutes, he was soon out in front of his quarters, where he was met by Meade and others. Meade was greatly nettled by the fact that he was absent from his command at such a time, and was pacing up and down with great strides, and dictating orders to his chief of staff, General Webb, who was with him, in tones which showed very forcibly the intensity of his feelings. The President, who was aboard his boat anchored out in the river, soon heard of the attack, and he was kept informed of the events which were taking place by his son Robert, who carried the news to him. General Grant, with his usual aggressiveness, telegraphed to the Army of the James, "This may be a signal for leaving. Be ready to take advantage of it." It was nearly 2 hours before any very definite information could be obtained, but the news began to be favorable, and by 8:30 it was learned that our whole line had been recaptured, many prisoners taken, and that everything was again quiet. Mr. Lincoln now sent a telegram to the Secretary of War, winding up with the words, "Robert just now tells me there was a little rumpus up the line this morning, ending about where it began." Generals Meade and Ord returned as soon as they could to their respective commands and took vigorous measures against the enemy. It seems that the Richmond authorities had come to the conclusion that their position was no longer tenable and that their army must retreat as soon as possible. A successful attack on our right, it was hoped, would throw our troops into confusion, and while we were maturing plans for the recapture of the lost portion of our lines and drawing in troops from our left for this purpose, Lee would find an opportunity to make a forced march with his army toward the Carolinas. This attack was one of the most dramatic events of the siege of Petersburg. It was commanded by General J.B. Gordon. There had been placed at his disposal for the purpose about one-half of Lee's entire army. For some time, men had been leaving the ranks of the enemy and making their way to us through the lines at night. The arms which they brought in were purchased from them at a fair price, and everything possible was done to encourage these desertions. The attacking party, knowing of this practice, took advantage of it and succeeded in having his skirmishers gain an entrance to our lines in the guise of deserters and suddenly make prisoners of our pickets. Just before dawn, our trench guards were overpowered, our main line was broken between two of our batteries, and Fort Stedman, after a brief but gallant resistance, was captured and its guns turned against our own troops. Several more batteries to the right and left were soon taken, and as friends could not be distinguished from foes owing to the darkness, it was for a time difficult for our troops to use artillery. Further assaults, however, were handsomely repulsed. As soon as there was sufficient light, a heavy artillery fire was concentrated on the enemy, and at 7:45 Hartranft advanced towards Fort Stedman and recaptured it with comparatively little loss. The movement was well planned and carried out with skill and boldness, but it proved a signal failure. It was a desperate military gamble with very few chances of winning. It was a curious coincidence that on the same day that Lee was preparing for his assault on our right, Grant was writing his orders for a general movement of the Union armies against the enemy's right. General Grant proposed to the President that forenoon that he should accompany him on a trip to the Petersburg front. The invitation was promptly accepted, and several hours were spent in visiting the troops, who cheered the President enthusiastically. He was greatly interested in looking at the prisoners who had been captured that morning, and while at Meade's headquarters about 2:00, sent a dispatch to Stanton saying, "I have nothing to add to what General Meade reports, except that I have seen the prisoners myself, and they look like there might be the number he states, 1,600. The President carried a map with him, which he took out of his pocket and examined several times. He had the exact location of the troops marked on it, and he exhibited a singularly accurate knowledge of the various positions. Upon the return to headquarters at City Point, he sat for a while by the campfire, and as the smoke curled about his head during certain shiftings of the wind, and he brushed it away from time to time by waving his right hand in front of his face, he entertained the General-in-Chief and several members of the staff by talking in a most interesting manner about public affairs, and illustrating the subjects mentioned with his incomparable anecdotes. At first his manner was grave and his language much more serious than usual. He spoke of the appalling difficulties encountered by the administration, the losses in the field, the perplexing financial problems, and the foreign complications, but said they had all been overcome by the unswerving patriotism of the people, the devotion of the loyal North, and the superb fighting qualities of the troops. After a while he spoke in a more cheerful vein and said, "England will live to regret her inimical attitude towards us." After the collapse of the rebellion, John Bull will find that he has injured himself much more seriously than us. His action reminds me of a barber in Sangamon County in my state. He had just gone to bed when a stranger came along and said he must be shaved, that he had a 4 days' beard on his face and was going to take a girl to a ball, and that beard must come off. Well, the barber got up reluctantly and dressed and seated the man in a chair with a back so low that every time he bore down on him, he came near dislocating his victim's neck. He began by lathering his face, including his nose, eyes, and ears, stropped his razor on his boot, and then made a drive at the man's countenance as if he had practiced mowing in a stubble field. He cut a bold swath across the right cheek, carrying away the beard, a pimple, and 2 warts. The man in the chair ventured to remark, "You appear to make everything level as you go." "Yes," said the barber, "and if this handle don't break, I guess I'll get away with most of what's there." The man's cheeks were so hollow that the barber couldn't get down into the valleys with the razor, and the ingenious idea occurred to him to stick his finger in the man's mouth and press out the cheeks. Finally, he cut clear through the cheek and into his own finger. He pulled the finger out of the man's mouth, snapped the blood off it, glared at him, and cried, "There, you lantern-jawed cuss, you've made me cut my finger." And so England will discover that she has got the South into a pretty bad scrape by trying to administer to her, and in the end she will find that she has only cut her own finger. After the laugh which followed this story had exhausted itself, General Grant asked, "Mr. President, did you at any time doubt the final success of the cause?" "Never for a moment," was the prompt and emphatic reply, as Mr. Lincoln leaned forward in his camp chair and enforced his words by a vigorous gesture of his right hand. "Mr. Seward, when he visited me last summer, gave a very interesting account of the complications and embarrassments arising from the Mason and Slidell affair when those commissioners were captured on board the English vessel Trent," remarked General Grant. "Yes," said the President, "Seward studied up all the works ever written on international law and came to cabinet meetings loaded to the muzzle with the subject. We gave due consideration to the case, but at that critical period of the war it was soon decided to deliver up the prisoners. It was a pretty bitter pill to swallow, but I contented myself with believing that England's triumph in the matter would be short-lived, and that after ending our war successfully, we would be so powerful that we could call her to account for all the embarrassments she had inflicted upon us. I felt a good deal like the sick man in Illinois who was told he probably hadn't many days longer to live, and he ought to make his peace with any enemies he might have. He said the man he hated worst of all was a fellow named Brown in the next village, and he guessed he had better begin on him. So Brown was sent for, and when he came, the sick man began to say, in a voice as meek as Moses, that he wanted to die at peace with all his fellow creatures, and he hoped he and Brown could now shake hands and bury all their enmity. The scene was becoming altogether too pathetic for Brown, who had to get out his handkerchief and wipe the gathering tears from his eyes. It wasn't long before he melted and gave his hand to his neighbor, and they had a regular love feast of forgiveness. After a parting that would have softened the heart of a grindstone, Brown had about reached the room door when the sick man rose up on his elbow and called out to him, "But see here, Brown, if I should happen to get well, mind that old grudge stands." So I thought that if this nation should happen to get well, we might want that old grudge against England to stand. It was a singular sequel to this conversation that the officer to whom he was then speaking became Mr. Lincoln's successor in the presidential chair, and carried out this determination by securing a settlement of the account known in history as the Alabama claims, and the payment from England of $15.5 millions as compensation for damages inflicted upon our commerce. The President now went aboard his boat to spend the night. The next morning he wandered into the tent of the headquarters telegraph operator, where several of us were sitting. He pulled out of his pocket a telegram which he had received from the Secretary of War, and his face assumed a broad smile as he said, "Well, the serious Stanton is actually becoming facetious. Just listen to what he says in his dispatch." Your telegram and Park's report of the scrimmage this morning are received. The rebel rooster looks a little the worse, as he could not hold the fence. We have nothing new here. Now you are away, everything is quiet, and the tormentors vanished. I hope you will remember General Harrison's advice to his men at Tippecanoe, that they can see as well a little farther off. 3 tiny kittens were crawling about the tent at the time. The mother had died, and the little wanderers were expressing their grief by mewing piteously. Mr. Lincoln picked them up, took them in his lap, stroked their soft fur, and murmured, "Poor little creatures, don't cry. You'll be taken good care of," and turning to Bowers said, "Colonel, I hope you will see that these poor little motherless waifs are given plenty of milk and treated kindly." Bowers replied, "I will see, Mr. President, that they are taken in charge by the cook of our mess and are well cared for." Several times during his stay, Mr. Lincoln was found fondling these kittens. He would wipe their eyes tenderly with his handkerchief, stroke their smooth coats, and listen to them purring their gratitude to him. It was a curious sight at an army headquarters upon the eve of a great military crisis in the nation's history, to see the hand which had affixed the signature to the Emancipation Proclamation and had signed the commissions of all the heroic men who served the cause of the Union, from the General-in-Chief to the lowest lieutenant, tenderly caressing 3 stray kittens. It well illustrated the kindness of the man's disposition, and showed the childlike simplicity which was mingled with the grandeur of his nature. General Grant had sent word to Sheridan, whose troops were now crossing the James, to come in person to headquarters, and early on the morning of March 26 he arrived. Rawlins and several other officers were in front of our quarters at the time, and upon seeing Sheridan, who had been separated from us for so long a time, we hurried forward to greet him. Rawlins, in his enthusiasm, seized both of Sheridan's hands in his own, wrung them vigorously, and then went to patting him on the back. Sheridan returned all the greetings warmly, and Rawlins now informed him that General Grant had made up his mind to send the cavalry through to join Sherman, destroying all communications as they went. Sheridan looked greatly annoyed at this information, and Rawlins agreed with him that such a move ought not to be made. Sheridan was told that the General-in-Chief was awaiting him in his quarters, and went in and had a long talk. The General showed him the written instructions which he had prepared, and to which Rawlins had just referred. They directed him to proceed with his cavalry around Lee's right, and then to move independently under other instructions. Sheridan felt convinced from what was said verbally that he was expected to cut loose and move down to Sherman's army. Some of the staff now entered the room and found Sheridan arguing against the policy of such a move. When he rose up to go, the General followed him out and had a few words of private conversation. We learned afterward that he told Sheridan that the part of the instructions to which he objected was merely a blind, that he intended to end the contest at once where we were, and that Sheridan was to operate against Lee's right and be in at the death. He said, in case the operations of the cavalry should not be an entire success, the people would take it for granted that a definite movement which they had been expected had been a complete failure, and they would be greatly discouraged. So I wanted the impression to prevail that a different movement had been contemplated. I really have no intention of sending you to Sherman. This was the General's little secret, which he had kept from all the staff, and revealed to the cavalry commander, Sheridan, only at the last moment. Sheridan was made happy by this conversation, and immediately told it to Rawlins, who was as much delighted as Sheridan himself. It was decided that upon this day Mr. Lincoln would review a portion of the Army of the James on the north side of the James River, and Sheridan was invited to join the party from headquarters who were to accompany the President. The boat started from City Point at 11 o'clock. At breakfast, General Grant said to me, "I shall accompany the President, who is to ride Cincinnati, as he seems to have taken a fancy to him. I wish you would take Mrs. Lincoln and Mrs. Grant to the reviewing ground in our headquarters ambulance." I expressed my pleasure at being selected for so pleasant a mission, and arranged to have the ambulance and 2 good horses put aboard the headquarters boat, which was to carry the party up the river. Captain Barnes, who commanded the vessel which had escorted the President's steamer, was to be one of the party, and I loaned him my horse. This was a favor which was usually accorded with some reluctance to naval officers when they came ashore, for these men of the ocean at times tried to board the animal on the starboard side, and often rolled in the saddle as if there was a heavy sea on. And if the horse, in his anxiety to rid himself of a sea monster, tried to scrape his rider off by rubbing against a tree, the officer attributed the unseamanlike conduct of the animal entirely to the fact that his steering gear had become unshipped. A naval hero not long before had borrowed a horse ashore and attempted to make his seat firmer on deck by grappling the animal's beam ends with his spurs, which caused the horse to run a little too free before the wind, and when the officer could not succeed in making him shorten sail by hauling in on the reins, he took out his jackknife and dug it in the animal's flanks, swearing that if he could not bring the craft to in any other way, he would scuttle it. Navy officers were about as reluctant to lend their boats to army people for fear they would knock holes in the bottom when jumping in, breaking the oars and catching crabs, and stave in the bows through an excess of modesty which manifested itself in a reluctance to give the command, "Way enough," in time when approaching a wharf. The President was in a more gloomy mood than usual on the trip up the James. He spoke with much seriousness about the situation, and did not attempt to tell a single anecdote. As the boat passed the point where Sheridan's cavalry was crossing the river on the pontoon bridge, he manifested considerable interest in watching the troopers, and addressed a number of questions to their commander. When the boat reached the landing on the north side of the river, I helped the two distinguished ladies who had been entrusted to my care into the ambulance and started for the reviewing ground about 2 miles distant. The horsemen got the start of us and made good time, but as the road was swampy and part of it corduroyed with the trunks of small trees, without much reference to their relative size or regularity of position, the ambulance could make but slow progress. Some additional springs had been put under it, and cross seats managed so as to make it ride more easily than the ordinary army ambulance, but the improved springs only served to toss the occupants higher in the air when the wheels struck a particularly aggravating obstacle. Mrs. Lincoln, finding we were losing time and fearing we would miss part of the review, expressed a wish to move faster, and I reluctantly gave the order to the driver. We were still on a corduroyed portion of the road, and when the horses trotted, the mud flew in all directions, and a sudden jolt lifted the party clear off the seats, jammed the ladies' hats against the top of the wagon, and bumped their heads as well. Mrs. Lincoln now insisted on getting out and walking, but as the mud was nearly hub-deep, Mrs. Grant and I persuaded her that we had better stick to the wagon as our only ark of refuge. Finally, we reached our destination, but it was some minutes after the review had begun. Mrs. Ord and the wives of several of the officers who had come up from Fort Monroe for the purpose appeared on horseback as a mounted escort to Mrs. Lincoln and Mrs. Grant. This added a special charm to the scene, and the review passed off with peculiar brilliancy. Mrs. Grant enjoyed the day with great zest, but Mrs. Lincoln had suffered so much from the fatigue and annoyances of her overland trip that she was not in a mood to derive much pleasure from the occasion. I made up my mind that ambulances, viewed as vehicles for driving distinguished ladies to military reviews, were not a stupendous success, and that thereafter they had better be confined to their legitimate uses of transporting the wounded and attending funerals. Upon the return trip on the boat, the President seemed to recover his spirits. Perhaps the manifestation of strength on the part of the splendid Army of the James, which he had witnessed at the review, had served to cheer him up. He told one excellent story on the way back. In speaking of a prominent general and the failure of the numerous attempts on the President's part to make the officer's services useful to the country, and the necessity finally of relieving him from all command, he said, "I was not more successful than the blacksmith in our town in my boyhood days, when he tried to put to a useful purpose a big piece of wrought iron that was in the shop. He heated it, put it on the anvil, and said, 'I'm going to make a sledgehammer out of you.' After a while, he stopped hammering it, looked at it, and remarked, 'Guess I've drawed you out a little too fine for a sledgehammer. Reckon I'd better make a clevis of you.' He stuck it in the fire, blew the bellows, got up a good heat, then began shaping the iron again on the anvil. Pretty soon he stopped, sized it up with his eye, and said, "Guess I've drawed you out too thin for a clevis. Suppose I better make a clevis bolt of you." He put it in the fire, bore down still harder on the bellows, drew out the iron, and went to work at it once more on the anvil. In a few minutes he stopped, took a look, and exclaimed, "Well, now I've got you down a leetle too thin even to make a clevis bolt out of you." Then he rammed it in the fire again, threw his whole weight on the bellows, got up a white heat on the iron, jerked it out, carried it in the tongs to the water barrel, held it over the barrel, and cried, "I've tried to make a sledgehammer of you and failed. I've tried to make a clevis of you and failed. I've tried to make a clevis bolt of you and failed. Now, darn you, I'm going to make a fizzle of you." And with that he soused it in the water and let it fizz. It was nearly dark when the party returned to City Point. After dinner the band was brought down to the steamboat, and a dance was improvised. Several ladies were aboard, and they and the officers danced till midnight. Neither the President nor General Grant joined, even in a square dance, but sat in the after part of the boat conversing. Sheridan stayed overnight at City Point and started early in the morning for the cavalry headquarters on the Petersburg front. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Meeting of Grant and Sherman at City Point. Amusing colloquy between Mrs. Grant and Sherman. Meeting of Sherman and Sheridan. The famous conference aboard the River Queen. Grant starts on his last campaign. Stormbound. Grant and Sheridan confer. Grant on Warren's front. Carrying instructions to Sheridan. Sherman, in his correspondence, had intimated a desire to have a personal conference with his chief before the general movement of all the armies took place, and it was learned on March 27 that he had arrived at Fort Monroe and was on his way up the James. Grant telegraphed to several prominent officers to meet Sherman that evening at headquarters. Late in the afternoon, the Russia, a captured steamer, arrived with Sherman on board, and General Grant and 2 or 3 of us who were with him at the time started down to the wharf to greet the Western commander. Before we reached the foot of the steps, Sherman had jumped ashore and was hurrying forward with long strides to meet his chief. As they approached, Grant cried out, "How do you do, Sherman?" "How are you, Grant?" replied Sherman, and in a moment they stood upon the steps with their hands locked in a cordial grasp, uttering earnest words of familiar greeting. Their encounter was more like that of 2 schoolboys coming together after a vacation than the meeting of the chief actors in the great war tragedy. Sherman walked up with the General-in-Chief to headquarters, where Mrs. Grant extended to the illustrious visitor a cordial greeting. Sherman then seated himself with the others by the campfire and gave a most graphic description of the stirring events of his march through Georgia. The story was the more charming from the fact that it was related without the manifestation of the slightest egotism. His field of operations had covered more than half of the entire theater of war. His orders always spoke with the true bluntness of the soldier. He had fought from valley depths to mountain heights and marched from inland rivers to the sea. Never were listeners more enthusiastic. Never was a speaker more eloquent. The story, told as he alone could tell it, was a grand epic related with Homeric power. At times he became humorous, and in a nervous, off-hand, rattling manner, recounted a number of amusing incidents of the famous march. He said, among other things, "My old veterans got on pretty familiar terms with me on the march, and often used to keep up a running conversation with me as I rode along by their side. One day a man in the ranks had pulled off his shoes and stockings and rolled up his trousers as far as they would go to wade across a creek we had struck. I couldn't help admiring his magnificently developed limbs, which might have served as models for a sculptor, and I called out to him, 'A good stout pair of legs you've got there, my man.' 'Yes, General, they're not bad underpinning,' he replied, looking down at them with evident pride. 'I wouldn't mind exchanging mine for them, if you don't object,' I continued. He sized up my legs with his eye, and evidently considered them mere spindle shanks compared with his, and then looked up at me and said, "General, if it's all the same to you, I guess I'd rather not swap." Sherman then went on to talk about his famous bummers, saying, "They are not stragglers or mere self-constituted foragers, as many have been led to suppose, but they are organized for a very useful purpose from the adventurous spirits who are always found in the ranks. They serve as feelers, who keep in advance and on the flanks of the main columns, spy out the land, and discover where the best supplies are to be found. They are indispensable in feeding troops when compelled, like my army, to live off the country, and in destroying the enemy's communications. The bummers are, in fact, a regular institution. I was amused at what one of Schofield's officers told me at Goldsboro. He said Schofield's army was maintaining a telegraph line to keep up communication with the sea-coast, and that one of my men, who was a little more previous than the rest, and was far in advance of my army, was seen up a telegraph pole, hacking away at the wires with a hatchet. The officer yelled out to him, "What are you doing there? You're destroying one of our own telegraph lines." The man cast an indignant look at his questioner, and said, as he continued his work of destruction, "I'm one of Billy Sherman's bummers, and the last thing he said to us when we started out on this hunt was, 'Be sure and cut all the telegraph wires you come across, and don't go to fooling away time asking who they belong to.'" After the interview had continued nearly an hour, Grant said to Sherman, "I'm sorry to break up this entertaining conversation, but the President is aboard the River Queen, and I know he will be anxious to see you. Suppose we go and pay him a visit before dinner." "All right," cried Sherman, and the general started down the steps, and were soon after seated in the cabin of the steamer with the President. In about an hour the two commanders came back and entered the general-in-chief's hut. I was there talking to Mrs. Grant at the time. She, with her usual thoughtfulness, had prepared some tea, and was awaiting the return of the generals. She at once inquired in her womanly way, "Did you see Mrs. Lincoln?" "Oh," replied her husband, "we went rather on a business errand, and I did not ask for Mrs. Lincoln." "And I didn't even know she was aboard," added Sherman. "Well, you are a pretty pair," exclaimed Mrs. Grant. "I do not see how you could have been so neglectful." "Well, Julia," said her husband, "we are going to pay another visit in the morning, and will take good care then to make amends for our conduct today. "And now let us talk further about the immediate movements of my army," said Sherman. "Perhaps you don't want me here listening to all your secrets," remarked Mrs. Grant. "Do you think we can trust her, Grant?" exclaimed Sherman, casting a sly glance at Mrs. Grant. "I'm not so sure about that, Sherman," said the commander, entering into the spirit of fun which had now taken possession of the trio. "Public documents, in disseminating items of information, are accustomed to say, 'Know all men by these presents.' I think it would be just as effective to say, 'Know one woman,' for then all men would be certain to hear of it." Sherman laughed heartily at this way of putting it, and said, "Now, Mrs. Grant, let me examine you, and I can soon tell whether you are likely to understand our plans well enough to betray them to the enemy." "Very well," she answered. "I'm ready for all your questions." Then Sherman turned his chair squarely toward her, folded his arms, assumed the tone and look of a first-class pedagogue, and in a manner which became more and more amusing as the conversation went on, proceeded to ask all sorts of geographical questions about the Carolinas and Virginia. Mrs. Grant caught the true essence of the humor, and gave replies which were the perfection of drollery. When asked where a particular river in the South was, she would locate it 1,000 miles away, and describe it as running upstream instead of down. And when questioned about a southern mountain, she would place it somewhere in the region of the North Pole. Railroads and canals were also mixed up in interminable confusion. She had studied the maps in camp very carefully, and had an excellent knowledge of the geography of the theater of war, and this information stood her in good stead in carrying on the little comedy which was being enacted. In a short time Sherman turned to his chief, who had been greatly amused by the byplay, and exclaimed, "Well, Grant, I think we can trust her." And then, speaking again to the general's wife, he said, "Never mind, Mrs. Grant. Perhaps some day the women will vote and control affairs, and then they will take us men in hand and subject us to worse cross-examinations than that." "Not if my plan of female suffrage is ever adopted," remarked the chief. "Why, Ulysses, you never told me you had any plans regarding that subject," said Mrs. Grant. "Oh, yes," continued the general, "I would give each married woman 2 votes. Then the wives would all be represented at the polls without there being any divided families on the subject of politics." Dinner was now announced, and Sherman escorted Mrs. Grant to the mess room and occupied a seat beside her at the table. In the evening several officers came to pay their respects to Sherman. Sheridan had been telegraphed to come to headquarters, but he did not appear until nearly midnight, and after all the others had left. He had been delayed several hours by his train running off the track on the military railroad. Sherman had been told by Grant about the plans he had discussed with Sheridan for the operations of the cavalry, and Sherman urged that it should join him after destroying the railroads on the way. Sheridan became a good deal nettled at this, and argued earnestly against it, but General Grant soon cut short the discussion by saying that it had been definitely decided that Sheridan was to remain with our army then in front of Petersburg. Sheridan's command was made separate from the Army of the Potomac and was to be subject only to direct orders from the General-in-Chief. The cavalry commander had cheerfully given up the command of the Middle Military Division to take the field at the head of the Cavalry Corps, and General Grant felt that he was entitled to every consideration which could be shown him. The next morning, March 28, Admiral Porter came to headquarters, and in the course of his conversation said to Sherman, "When you were in the region of those swamps and overflowed rivers coming through the Carolinas, didn't you wish you had my gunboats with you?" "Yes," replied Sherman, "for those swamps were very much like that Western fellow's 4th of July oration, of which the newspapers said it was only knee-deep, but spread out over all creation." One day on the march, while my men were wading a river which was surrounded for miles by swamps on each side, after they had been in the water for about an hour, with not much prospect of reaching the other side, one of them cried out to his chum, "Say, Tommy, I'm blowed if I don't believe we struck this river lengthways." After spending a quarter of an hour together, General Grant said that the President was expecting them aboard his boat, and the 2 generals and the Admiral started for the River Queen. No one accompanied them. There now occurred in the upper saloon of that vessel the celebrated conference between these 4 magnates, the scene of which has been so faithfully transferred to canvas by the artist Healy. It was in no sense a council of war, but only an informal interchange of views between the 4 men who, more than any others, held the destiny of the nation in their hands. Upon the return of the generals and the Admiral to headquarters, they entered the General-in-Chief's hut where Mrs. Grant and 1 or 2 of us were sitting. The chief said to his wife, "Well, Julia, as soon as we reached the boat this morning, I was particular to inquire after Mrs. Lincoln, and to say that we desired to pay our respects to her. The President went to her stateroom and soon returned, saying that she was not well and asking us to excuse her." General Grant afterward told us the particulars of the interview. It began by his explaining to the President the military situation and prospects, saying that the crisis of the war was now at hand, as he expected to move at once around the enemy's left and cut him off from the Carolinas, and that his only apprehension was that Lee might move out before him and evacuate Petersburg and Richmond, but that if he did, there would be a hot pursuit. Sherman assured the President that in such a contingency his army, by acting on the defensive, could resist both Johnston and Lee till Grant could reach them, and that then the enemy would be caught in a vice and have his life promptly crushed out. Mr. Lincoln asked if it would not be possible to end the matter without a pitched battle, with the attendant losses and suffering, but was informed that that was a matter not within the control of our commanders and must rest necessarily with the enemy. Lincoln spoke about the course which he thought had better be pursued after the war, and expressed an inclination to lean toward a generous policy. In speaking about the Confederate political leaders, he intimated, though he did not say so in express terms, that it would relieve the situation if they should escape to some foreign country. Sherman related many interesting incidents which occurred in his campaign. Grant talked less than anyone present. The President twice expressed some apprehension about Sherman being away from his army, but Sherman assured him that he had left matters safe in Schofield's hands and that he would start back himself that day. That afternoon Sherman took leave of those at headquarters and returned to his command in the Bat, as that vessel was faster than the one which had brought him up the coast. The troops had been in motion the previous night, and the general had decided that headquarters should be moved on the morning of the 29th. The horses were to be put aboard the train which was to take the general and staff to the Petersburg front. About 8:30 Mr. Lincoln came ashore to say good-bye. We had the satisfaction of hearing one good story from him before parting. General Grant was telling him about the numerous ingenious and impractical suggestions that were made to him almost daily as to the best way of destroying the enemy, and said, "The last plan proposed was to supply our men with bayonets just a foot longer than those of the enemy, and then charge them. When they met, our bayonets would go clear through the enemy, while theirs would not reach far enough to touch our men, and the war would be ended." Mr. Lincoln laughed and remarked, "Well, there is a good deal of terror in cold steel. I had a chance to test it once myself. When I was a young man, I was walking along a back street in Louisville one night about 12 o'clock, when a very tough-looking citizen sprang out of an alleyway, reached up to the back of his neck, pulled out a bowie knife that seemed to my stimulated imagination about 3 feet long, and planted himself square across my path. For 2 or 3 minutes he flourished his weapon in front of my face, appearing to try to see just how near he could come to cutting my nose off without quite doing it. He could see in the moonlight that I was taking a good deal of interest in the proceeding, and finally he yelled out as he steadied the knife close to my throat, "Stranger, can you lend me $5 on that?" I never reached in my pocket and got out money so fast in all my life. I handed him a banknote and said, "There's 10, neighbor. Now put up your scythe." The general soon after bade an affectionate goodbye to Mrs. Grant, kissed her repeatedly as she stood at the front door of his quarters. She bore the parting bravely, although her pale face and sorrowful look told of the sadness that was in her heart. The party, accompanied by the President, then walked down to the railroad station. Mr. Lincoln looked more serious than at any other time since he had visited headquarters. The lines in his face seemed deeper, and the rings under his eyes were of a darker hue. It was plain that the weight of responsibility was oppressing him. Could it have been a premonition that with the end of this last campaign would come the end of his life? 5 minutes' walk brought the party to the train. There the President gave the General and each member of the staff a cordial shake of the hand, and then stood near the rear end of the car while we mounted the platform. As the train was about to start, we all raised our hats respectfully. The salute was returned by the President, and he said in a voice broken by an emotion he could ill conceal, "Goodbye, gentlemen. God bless you all. Remember, your success is my success." The signal was given to start. The train moved off. Grant's last campaign had begun. The general sat down near the end of the car, drew from his pocket the flint and slow match that he always carried, struck a light, and was soon wreathed in the smoke of the inevitable cigar. I took a seat near him with several other officers of the staff, and he at once began to talk over his plans. Referring to Mr. Lincoln, he said, "The President is one of the few visitors I have had who have not attempted to extract from me a knowledge of my movements, although he is the only one who has a right to know them. He intends to remain at City Point for the present, and he will be the most anxious man in the country to hear from us, his heart is so wrapped up in our success. But I think we can send him some good news in a day or two." I never knew the General to be more sanguine of victory than in starting out on this campaign. When we reached the end of the railroad, we mounted our horses, started down the Vaughan Road, and went into camp for the night in an old cornfield just south of that road, close to Gravelly Run. That night, March 29, the army was disposed in the following order from right to left: Weitzel in front of Richmond, with a portion of the Army of the James; Parke and Wright holding our works in front of Petersburg; Ord extending to the intersection of Hatcher's Run and the Vaughan Road; Humphreys stretching beyond Dabney's Mill, Warren on the extreme left, reaching as far as the junction of the Vaughan Road and the Boynton Plank Road, and Sheridan still farther west at Dinwiddie Courthouse. The weather had been fair for several days, and the roads were getting in as good condition for the movement of troops as could be expected, for in that section of country in summer the dust was usually so thick that the army could not see where to move, and in winter the mud was so deep that it could not move anywhere. The weather had now become cloudy, and toward evening rain began to fall. It descended in torrents all night, and continued with but little interruption during the next day. The country was densely wooded and the ground swampy, and by the evening of the 30th whole fields had become beds of quicksand in which the troops waded in mud above their ankles, horses sank to their bellies, and wagons threatened to disappear altogether. The men began to feel that if anyone in after years should ask them whether they had been through Virginia, they could say yes in a number of places. The roads soon became sheets of water, and it looked as if the saving of that army would require the services not of a Grant, but of a Noah. Soldiers would call out to officers as they rode by, "I say, fetch along the pontoons. When are the gunboats coming up?" The buoyancy of the day before was giving place to gloom. Men lost their tempers, and those who employed profanity on such occasions as a means of mental relaxation wanted to set up a mark and go to swearing at it. Some began to be apprehensive that the whole movement was premature. This led to an animated debate at headquarters. General Rawlins expressed the opinion around the campfire on the morning of the 30th that no forage could be hauled out to our cavalry, that Joe Johnston might come up in our rear if we remained long in our present position, and that the success of turning Lee's right depended on our celerity, that now he had been given time to make his dispositions to thwart us, and that it might be better to fall back and make a fresh start later on. General Grant replied by saying that if Johnston could move rapidly enough in such weather to reach us, he, Grant, would turn upon him with his whole command, crush him, and then go after Lee, and that as soon as the weather cleared up the roads would dry rapidly, and the men's spirits would recover all their former buoyancy. The general then entered his tent, and Rawlins followed him. Just then we saw Sheridan turning in from the Vaughan Road with a staff officer and an escort of about a dozen cavalrymen, and coming toward our headquarters camp. He was riding his white pacer named Breckinridge, a horse which had been captured from General Breckinridge in the Valley of Virginia. But instead of striking a pacing gait now, it was at every step driving its legs knee-deep into the quicksand with the regularity of a pile-driver. As soon as Sheridan dismounted, he was asked with much eagerness about the situation on the extreme left. He took a decidedly cheerful view of matters and entered upon an animated discussion of the coming movements. He said, "I can drive in the whole cavalry force of the enemy with ease, and if an infantry force is added to my command, I can strike out for Lee's right and either crush it or force him so to weaken his entrenched lines that our troops in front of him can break through and march into Petersburg." He warmed up with the subject as he proceeded, threw the whole energy of his nature into the discussion, and his cheery voice, beaming countenance, and impassioned language showed the earnestness of his convictions. "How do you expect to supply your command with forage if this weather lasts?" he was asked by one of the group. "Forage," said Sheridan. "I'll get up all the forage I want. I'll haul it out if I have to set every man in the command to corduroying roads and corduroy every mile of them from the railroad to Dinwiddie. I tell you, I'm ready to strike out tomorrow and go to smashing things." And pacing up and down, he chafed like a hound in the leash. We told him that this was the kind of talk we liked to hear, and that while General Grant felt no apprehension, it would do his heart good to listen to such words as had just been spoken. Sheridan, however, objected to obtruding his views unbidden upon the general-in-chief. Then we resorted to a stratagem. One of us went into the general's tent and told him Sheridan had just come in from the left and had been telling us some matters of much interest, and suggested that he be invited in and asked to state them. This was assented to, and Sheridan was told that the general wanted to hear what he had to say. Sheridan then went in and found Grant and Rawlins still discussing the situation. Several persons soon after came into the tent, and Sheridan, saying he was cold and wet, stepped out to the campfire. The general-in-chief remarked that he wanted to have some words with Sheridan in private before parting, and followed him out. Ingalls said his tent was vacant, and Grant and Sheridan entered it and had a talk there, in which a definite understanding was reached as to Sheridan's immediate movements. In about 20 minutes they came out, and Sheridan mounted his horse, waved us a good-bye with his hand, and rode off to Dinwiddie. The next morning, March 31, Sheridan reported that the enemy had been hard at work entrenching at Five Forks and to a point about a mile west of that place. Lee had been as prompt as Grant to recognize Five Forks, the junction of 5 roads, as a strategic point of great importance, and to protect his right, had sent there a large force of infantry and nearly all his cavalry. The rain had continued during the night of March 30, and on the morning of the 31st the weather was cloudy and dismal. General Grant had anticipated that Warren would be attacked that morning, and had warned him to be on the alert. Warren advanced his corps to develop with what force the enemy held the White Oak Road, and to try and drive him from it. But before he had gone far, he was met by a vigorous assault. When news came of the attack, General Grant directed me to go to the spot and look to the situation of affairs there. I found that Warren's troops were falling back, but he was reinforced by Humphreys, and by noon the enemy was checked. As soon as Grant was advised of the situation, he directed Meade to take the offensive vigorously, and the enemy was soon driven back. General Grant had now ridden out to the front, and hearing that he was at Mrs. Butler's house near the Boynton Plank Road, I joined him there. It was then a little after 1 o'clock. He had in the meantime ordered the headquarters camp to be moved to Dabney's Mill, about 2 miles from Meade's camp. Warren's corps was now ordered to move forward again for the purpose of deterring the enemy from detaching infantry from that portion of the line to send against Sheridan. The advance was made later in the afternoon, and with decided success. When this movement had been decided upon, General Grant directed me to go to Sheridan and explain what was taking place on Warren's and Humphreys' front, and have a full understanding with him as to the future operations in his vicinity. I rode rapidly down the Boynton Plank Road, and soon came to Gravelly Run. The bridge was destroyed, but my horse was able to ford the stream, notwithstanding the high water caused by the recent rains. Hearing heavy firing in the direction of the Five Forks Road, I hurried on in that direction by way of the Brooks Road, and soon saw a portion of our cavalry moving eastward, pressed by a superior force of the enemy, while another portion was compelled to fall back southward toward Dinwiddie. I turned the corner of the Brooks Cross Road and the Five Forks Road just as the rear of the latter body of cavalry was passing it, and found one of Sheridan's bands with his rear guard playing Nellie Bly as cheerfully as if furnishing music for a country picnic. Sheridan always made an effective use of his bands. They were usually mounted on gray horses, and instead of being relegated to the usual duty of carrying off the wounded and assisting the surgeons, they were brought out to the front and made to play the liveliest airs in their repertory, which produced excellent results in buoying up the spirits of the men. After having several of their instruments pierced by bullets, however, and the drums crushed by shells, as often happened, it must be admitted that the music, viewed purely in the light of an artistic performance, was open to adverse criticism. I found Sheridan a little north of Dinwiddie Court House, and gave him an account of matters on the left of the Army of the Potomac. He said he had had one of the liveliest days in his experience, fighting infantry and cavalry with only cavalry, but that he would hold his position at Dinwiddie at all hazards. He did not stop there, but declared his belief that with the corps of infantry which he expected to be put under his command, he could take the initiative the next morning and cut off the whole of the force which Lee had detached. He said, "This force is in more danger than I am. If I am cut off from the Army of the Potomac, it is cut off from Lee's army, and not a man in it ought ever to be allowed to get back to Lee. We at last have drawn the enemy's infantry out of its fortifications, and this is our chance to attack it." He begged me to go to General Grant at once and urge him to send me Wright's corps, because it had been under his command in the Valley of Virginia and was familiar with his way of fighting. I told him, as had been stated to him before, that Wright's corps was next to our extreme right, and that the only corps which could reach him by daylight was Warren's. I returned soon after to headquarters at Dabney's Mill, a distance of about 8 miles, reaching there at 7 p.m., and gave the general a full description of Sheridan's operations. He took in the situation in an instant, and at once telegraphed the substance of my report to Meade, and preparations soon began looking to the sending of Warren's corps and Mackenzie's small division of cavalry to report to Sheridan. It was expected that the infantry would reach its destination in ample time to take the offensive about daybreak, but one delay after another was met with, and Grant, Meade, and Sheridan spent a painfully anxious night in hurrying forward the movement. Ayer's division of Warren's corps had to rebuild the bridge over Gravelly Run, which took till 2 a.m. Warren, with his other 2 divisions, did not get started from their position on the White Oak Road till 5 a.m., and the hope of crushing the enemy was hourly growing less. This proved to be one of the busiest nights of the whole campaign. Generals were writing dispatches and telegraphing from dark to daylight. Staff officers were rushing from one headquarters to another, wading through swamps, penetrating forests, and galloping over corduroy roads, carrying instructions, getting information, and making extraordinary efforts to hurry up the movement of the troops. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. The Movement against Five Forks, the Battle of Five Forks, carrying the news of Five Forks to Grant, Grant prepares to assault the Petersburg lines, capturing the works at Petersburg, Grant writes dispatches under fire, capture of Forts Gregg and Whitworth. Early the next morning, April 1, General Grant said to me, "I wish you would spend the day with Sheridan's command and send me a bulletin every half hour or so, advising me fully as to the progress made. You know my views, and I want you to give them to Sheridan fully. Tell him the contemplated movement is left entirely in his hands, and he must be responsible for its execution. I have every confidence in his judgment and ability. I hope that there may now be an opportunity of fighting the enemy's infantry outside of their fortifications." I set out with 6 mounted orderlies to act as couriers in transmitting field bulletins, and met Sheridan about 10 a.m. on the Five Forks Road not far from J. Boisseau's house. Ayres had his division on this road, having arrived about daylight, and Griffin had reached J. Boisseau's between 7 and 8 a.m. I had a full conference with Sheridan, in which he told me that the force in front of him had fallen back early in the morning, that he had pursued with his cavalry, had had several brushes with the enemy, and was driving him steadily back, that he had had his patience sorely tried by the delays which had occurred in getting the infantry to him, but that he was going to make every effort to strike a heavy blow with all the infantry and cavalry as soon as he could get them into position, provided the enemy should make a stand behind his entrenchments at Five Forks, which seemed likely. While we were talking, General Warren, who had accompanied Crawford's division, rode up and reported in person to Sheridan. It was then 11 o'clock. A few minutes before noon, Colonel Babcock came over from headquarters and said to Sheridan, "General Grant directs me to say to you that if, in your judgment, the Fifth Corps would do better under one of its division commanders, you are authorized to relieve General Warren and order him to report to him, General Grant, at headquarters." General Sheridan replied in effect that he hoped such a step as that might not become necessary, and then he went on to speak of his plan of battle. We all rode on farther to the front, and soon met General Devon of the cavalry, who was considerably elated by his successes of the morning, and loudly demanded to be permitted to make a general attack on the enemy. Sheridan told him he didn't believe he had ammunition enough. Said Devon, "I guess I've got enough to give 'em one surge more." Colonel Babcock now left us to return to headquarters. About 1 o'clock it was reported by the cavalry that the enemy was retiring to his entrenched positions at Five Forks, which was just north of the White Oak Road and parallel to it, his earthworks running from a point about 3/4 of a mile east of Five Forks to a point a mile west, with an angle or crotchet about 100 yards long, thrown back at right angles to the left of his line to protect that flank. Orders were at once given to Warren's corps to move up to the gravelly run Church Road, to the open ground near the church, and form in order of battle, with Ayres on the left, Crawford on his right, and Griffin in rear as a reserve. The corps was to wheel to the left and make its attack upon the angle, and then, moving westward, sweep down in rear of the enemy's entrenched line. The cavalry, principally dismounted, was to deploy in front of the enemy's line and engage his attention, and as soon as it heard the firing of our infantry, to make a vigorous assault upon his works. The Fifth Corps had borne the brunt of the fighting ever since the army had moved out on March 29, and the gallant men who composed it, and who had performed a conspicuous part in nearly every battle in which the Army of the Potomac had been engaged, seemed eager once more to cross bayonets with their old antagonists. But the movement was slow, the required formation seemed to drag, and Sheridan, chafing with impatience and consumed with anxiety, became as restive as a racer struggling to make the start. He made every possible appeal for promptness, dismounted from his horse, paced up and down, struck the clenched fist of one hand against the palm of the other, and fretted like a caged tiger. He exclaimed at one time, "This battle must be fought and won before the sun goes down. All the conditions may be changed in the morning. We have but a few hours of daylight left us. My cavalry are rapidly exhausting their ammunition, and if the attack is delayed much longer, they may have none left." And then another batch of staff officers was sent out to gallop through the mud and hurry up the columns. At 4 o'clock the formation was completed, the order for the assault was given, and the struggle for Pickett's entrenched line began. The Confederate infantry brigades were posted from left to right as follows: Terry, Corse, Stewart, Ransom, and Wallace. General Fitzhugh Lee, commanding the cavalry, had placed W. H. F. Lee's 2 brigades on the right of the line, Munford's division on the left, and Rosser's in rear of Hatcher's Run to guard the trains. I rode to the front, in company with Sheridan and Warren, with the head of Ayres' division, which was on the left. Ayres threw out a skirmish line and advanced across an open field, which sloped down gradually toward the dense woods just north of the White Oak Road. He soon met with a fire from the edge of these woods, a number of men fell, and the skirmish line halted and seemed to waver. Sheridan now began to exhibit those traits which always made him a tower of strength in the presence of an enemy. He put spurs to his horse and dashed along in front of the line of battle from left to right, shouting words of encouragement and having something cheery to say to every regiment. "Come on, men," he cried. "Go at 'em with a will. Move on at a clean jump, or you'll not catch one of 'em. They're all getting ready to run now, and if you don't get on them in 5 minutes, they'll every one get away from you. Now go for 'em." Just then a man on the skirmish line was struck in the neck. The blood spurted as if the jugular vein had been cut. "I'm killed," he cried, and dropped to the ground. "You're not hurt a bit," cried Sheridan. "Pick up your gun, man, and move right on to the front." Such was the electric effect of his words that the poor fellow snatched up his musket and rushed forward a dozen paces before he fell, never to rise again. The line of battle of weather-beaten veterans was now moving right along down the slope toward the woods with a steady swing that boded no good for Pickett's command, earthworks or no earthworks. Sheridan was mounted on his favorite black horse, Rienzi, which had carried him from Winchester to Cedar Creek, and which Buchanan Reed made famous for all time by his poem of Sheridan's Ride. The roads were muddy, the fields swampy, the undergrowth dense, and Rienzi, as he plunged and curveted, kept dashing the foam from his mouth and the mud from his heels. Had the Winchester pike been in a similar condition, it is altogether likely that he would not have made his famous 20 miles without breaking his own neck as well as Sheridan's. This historic horse derived his name from the fact that he was presented to Sheridan by the 2nd Michigan Cavalry in the little town of Rienzi, Mississippi, in 1862. After the famous ride, he was sometimes called Winchester. He was of Black Hawk blood. He bore Sheridan in nearly all his subsequent battles. When the animal died in 1878, in his 20th year, his body was stuffed and now stands in the museum on Governor's Island. The surviving veterans often decorate his body with flowers on Memorial Day. Mackenzie had been ordered up the Crump Road with directions to turn east on the White Oak Road and whip everything he met on that route. He encountered a small cavalry command and whipped it, according to orders, and then came galloping back to join in the general scrimmage. Soon Ayres's men met with a heavy fire on their left flank and had to change directions by facing more toward the west. As the troops entered the woods and moved forward over the boggy ground and struggled through the dense undergrowth, they were staggered by a heavy fire from the angle and fell back in some confusion. Sheridan now rushed into the midst of the broken lines and cried out, "Where is my battle flag?" As the sergeant who carried it rode up, Sheridan seized the crimson and white standard, waved it above his head, cheered on the men, and made heroic efforts to close up the ranks. Bullets were now humming like a swarm of bees about our heads, and shells were crashing through the ranks. A musket ball pierced the battle flag. Another killed the sergeant who had carried it. Another wounded an aide, Captain McGonigal, in the side. Others struck 2 or 3 of the staff officers' horses. All this time Sheridan was dashing from one point of the line to another, waving his flag, shaking his fist, encouraging, entreating, threatening, praying, swearing, the true personification of chivalry, the very incarnation of battle. It would be a sorry soldier who could help following such a leader. Ayres and his officers were equally exposing themselves at all points in rallying the men, and soon the line was steadied, for such troops could suffer but a momentary check. Ayres, with drawn saber, rushed forward once more with his veterans, who now behaved as if they had fallen back only to get a good ready, and with fixed bayonets and a rousing cheer, dashed over the earthworks, sweeping everything before them, and killing or capturing every man in their immediate front whose legs had not saved him. Sheridan spurred Rienzi up to the angle, and with a bound the animal carried his rider over the earthworks and landed among a line of prisoners who had thrown down their arms and were crouching close under the breastworks. Some of them called out, "What do you want us all to go to?" Then Sheridan's rage turned to humor, and he had a running talk with the Johnnies as they filed past. "Go right over there," he said to them, pointing to the rear. "Get right along now. Oh, drop your guns. You'll never need them any more. You'll all be safe over there. Are there any more of you? We want every one of you, fellas." Nearly 1,500 were captured at the angle. An orderly here came up to Sheridan, saluted, and said, "Colonel Forsyth of your staff is killed, sir." "It's no such thing," cried Sheridan. "I don't believe a word of it. You'll find Forsyth's all right." 10 minutes later Forsyth rode up. He had been mistaken for the gallant General Winthrop, who had fallen in the assault. Sheridan did not even seem surprised when he saw Forsyth, and merely said, "There, I told you so." This incident is mentioned as illustrative of a peculiar trait of Sheridan's character, which never allowed him to be disturbed by camp rumors, however disastrous. The dismounted cavalry had assaulted as soon as they heard the infantry fire open. The natty cavalrymen, with their tight-fitting jackets and short carbines, swarmed through the pine thickets and dense undergrowth, looking as if they had been especially equipped for crawling through knot-holes. The cavalry, commanded by the gallant Merritt, made a final dash, went over the earthworks with a hurrah, captured a battery of artillery, and scattered everything in front of them. Here Custer, Devon, Fitzhugh, and the other cavalry officers were in their element and vied with each other in deeds of valor. Crawford's division had moved off in a northerly direction, marching away from Ayres and leaving a gap between the two divisions. Sheridan became exceedingly annoyed at this circumstance, complained that Warren was not giving sufficient personal supervision to the infantry, and sent nearly all his staff officers to the Fifth Corps to see that the mistakes made were corrected. After the capture of the Angle, I started off toward the right to see how matters were going there. I went in the direction of Crawford's division on our right. Warren, whose personal gallantry was always conspicuous, had had his horse shot while with these troops. I passed around the left of the enemy's works, then rode due west to a point beyond the Ford Road. Here I rejoined Sheridan a little before dark. He was laboring with all the energy of his nature to complete the destruction of the enemy's forces and to make preparations to protect his own detached command from a possible attack by Lee's army in the morning. He said to me that he had just relieved Warren and placed Griffin in command of the Fifth Corps. I had been sending frequent bulletins to the General-in-Chief during the day, and now dispatched a courier announcing the change of corps commanders and giving the general result of the roundup. Sheridan had that day fought one of the most interesting tactical battles of the war, admirable in conception, brilliant in execution, strikingly dramatic in its incidents, and productive of immensely important results. I said to him, "It seems to me that you have exposed yourself today in a manner hardly justifiable on the part of a commander of such an important movement." His reply gave what seems to be the true key to his uniform success in the field. "I have never in my life taken a command into battle and had the slightest desire to come out alive unless I won." About 7:30 I started for General Headquarters. The roads in many places were corduroyed with captured muskets. Ammunition trains and ambulances were still struggling forward. Teamsters, prisoners, stragglers, and wounded were choking the roadway. The coffee boilers had kindled their fires in the woods. Cheers were resounding on all sides, and everybody was riotous over the victory. A horseman had to pick his way through this jubilant condition of things as best he could, as he did not have a clear right of way by any means. As I galloped past a group of men on the Boyton Plank Road, my orderly called out to them the news of the victory. The only response he got was from one of them, who raised his open hand to his face, put his thumb to his nose, and yelled, "No, you don't. April Fool." I then realized that it was the 1st of April. I had ridden so rapidly that I reached headquarters at Dabney's Mill before the arrival of the last courier I had dispatched. General Grant was sitting, with most of the staff about him, before a blazing campfire. He wore his blue cavalry overcoat, and the ever-present cigar was in his mouth. I began shouting the good news as soon as I got in sight, and in a moment all but the imperturbable General-in-Chief were on their feet, giving vent to boisterous demonstrations of joy. For some minutes there was a bewildering state of excitement, and officers fell to grasping hands, shouting, and hugging each other like schoolboys. The news meant the beginning of the end, the reaching of the last ditch. It pointed to peace and home. Dignity was thrown to the winds, and every man at that moment was in a fitting mood to dig his elbows into the ribs of the Archbishop of Canterbury, or to challenge the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to a game of leapfrog. The proprieties of army etiquette were so far forgotten in the enthusiasm of the occasion that as soon as I had thrown myself from my horse, I found myself rushing up to the General-in-Chief and clapping him on the back with my hand, to his no little astonishment and to the evident amusement of those about him. Footnote. Badeau, in his military history of Ulysses S. Grant, says in referring to this scene, The bearer of the good news was Colonel Horace Porter, one of the most abstemious men in the army, but he came up with so much enthusiasm, clapping the General-in-Chief on the back and otherwise demonstrating his joy, that the officer who shared his tent rebuked him at night for indulging too freely in drink at this critical juncture. But Porter had tasted neither wine nor spirits that day. He was only drunk with victory. Editor. End note. The General, as might have been expected, asked his usual question, "How many prisoners have been taken?" I was happy to report that the prisoners this time were estimated at over 5,000, and this was the only part of my recital that seemed to call forth a responsive expression from his impassive features. After having listened attentively to the description of Sheridan's day's work, the General, with scarcely a word of comment, walked into his tent, and by the light of a flickering candle took up his manifold writer, and after finishing several dispatches, handed them to an orderly to be sent over the field wires, came out and joined our group at the campfire, and said as coolly as if remarking upon the state of the weather, "I have ordered a general assault along the lines." This was about 9 o'clock in the evening. In his conversation, his sense of humor now began to assert itself. During the day I had sent him a bulletin saying, "I have noticed among the prisoners and dead many old men whose heads are quite bald." This was mentioned as an evidence that the enemy, in recruiting, was robbing the grave. Ingalls was sitting with us. His hair had become so thin that he used to part it low behind and comb the stray locks forward, trying to make the rear guard do picket duty at the front. The General delighted in teasing him on this subject, and looking towards him, he now said to me, "When I got your message today about the bald-headed men, I showed it to Ingalls and told him he had better take care and not fall into the hands of the enemy, for that is just the way they would be commenting on his head in their reports." Grant was anxious to have the different commands move against the enemy's lines at once to prevent Lee from withdrawing troops and sending them against Sheridan. Meade was all activity and so alive to the situation and so anxious to carry out the orders of the General-in-Chief that he sent word that he was going to have the troops make a dash at the works without waiting to form assaulting columns. Grant at 9:30 p.m. sent a message that he did not mean to have the corps attack without assaulting columns, but to let the batteries open at once and to feel out with skirmishers, and if the enemy was found to be leaving, to let the troops attack in their own way. The corps commanders reported that it would be impractical to make a successful assault until morning, but sent back replies full of enthusiasm and having in them a ring of the true soldierly metal. Ord said he would go into the enemy's works as a hot knife goes into butter. Wright sent word that when he started in he would make the fur fly, and said, "If the corps does half as well as I expect, we will have broken through the rebel lines in 15 minutes from the word go." Grant was highly pleased with the spirit evinced in these messages, and said, "I like the way Wright talks. It argues success. I heartily approve." The hour for the general assault was fixed at 4 o'clock the next morning. Miles was ordered to march with his division at midnight to reinforce Sheridan and enable him to make a stand against Lee in case he should move westward in the night. A little after midnight the general tucked himself into his camp bed and was soon sleeping as peacefully as if the next day was to be devoted to a picnic instead of a decisive battle. Everyone at headquarters had caught as many catnaps as he could, so as to be able to keep both eyes open the next day in the hope of getting a sight of Petersburg and possibly Richmond. And now 4 o'clock came, but no assault. It was found that to remove abatis, climb over chevaux de frise, jump rifle pits, and scale parapets, a little daylight would be of material assistance. At 4:45 there was a streak of gray in the heavens, which soon revealed another streak of gray formed by Confederate uniforms in the works opposite, and the charge was ordered. The thunder of hundreds of guns shook the ground like an earthquake, and soon the troops were engaged all along the lines. The general awaited for a while the result of the assault at headquarters, where he could be easily communicated with, and from which he could give general directions. At 5:15 a message came from Wright that he had carried the enemy's line in his front and was pushing in. Next came news from Parke that he had captured the outer works with 12 pieces of artillery and 800 prisoners. At 6:40 the general wrote a telegram with his own hand to Mr. Lincoln at City Point, as follows: "Both Wright and Parke got through the enemy's line. The battle now rages furiously. Sheridan, with his cavalry, the 5th Corps, and Miles's division of the 2nd Corps, which was sent to him since 1 this morning, is now sweeping down from the west. All now looks highly favorable. Ord is engaged, but I have not yet heard the result in his front." A cheering dispatch was also sent to Sheridan, winding up with the words, "I think nothing is now wanting but the approach of your force from the west to finish up the job on this side." Soon Ord was heard from as having broken through the entrenchments. Humphreys, too, had been doing gallant work. At 7:30 the line in his front was captured, and half an hour later Hayes's division of his corps had carried an important earthwork with 3 guns and most of the garrison. At 8:30 a.m. a dispatch was brought in from Ord saying that some of his troops had just captured the enemy's works south of Hatcher's Run. The general and staff now rode out to the front, as it was necessary to give immediate direction to the actual movements of the troops and prevent confusion from the overlapping and intermingling of the several corps as they pushed forward. He urged his horse over the works which Wright's corps had captured, and suddenly came upon a body of 3,000 prisoners marching to our rear. His whole attention was for some time riveted upon them, and we knew that he was enjoying his usual satisfaction in seeing so large a capture. Some of the guards told the prisoners who the general was, and they manifested great curiosity to get a good look at him. Next he came up with a division of Wright's corps, flushed with success, and rushed forward with a dash that was inspiriting beyond description. When they caught sight of the leader whom they had patiently followed from the Rapidan to Petersburg, their cheers broke forth with a will, and their enthusiasm knew no limit. The general galloped along toward the right, and soon met Meade, with whom he had been in constant communication, and who had been urging on the Army of the Potomac with all vigor. Congratulations were rapidly exchanged, and both went to pushing forward the good work. Grant, after taking in the situation, directed both Meade and Ord to face their commands more toward the east and close up toward the inner lines which covered Petersburg. Lee had been pushed so vigorously that he seemed for a time to be making but little effort to recover any of his lost ground, but now he made a determined fight against Parke's corps, which was threatening his inner line on his extreme left, and the bridge across the Appomattox. Repeated assaults were made, but Parke resisted them all successfully and could not be stirred from his position. Lee had ordered Longstreet's command from the north side of the James, and with these troops reinforced his extreme right. General Grant dismounted near a farmhouse which stood on a knoll, from which he could get a good view of the field of operations. He seated himself on the ground at the foot of a tree, and was soon busy receiving dispatches and writing orders to officers conducting the advance. The position was under fire, and as soon as the group of staff officers was seen, the enemy's guns began paying their respects to the party. This lasted for about a quarter of an hour, and as the fire became hotter and hotter, several of the officers, apprehensive for the general's safety, urged him to move to some less conspicuous position, but he kept on writing and talking, without the least interruption from the shots falling around him, and apparently not noticing what a target the place was becoming, or paying any heed to the gentle reminders to move on. After he had finished his dispatches, he got up, took a view of the situation, and as he started toward the other side of the farmhouse, said with a quizzical look at the group around him, "Well, they do seem to have the range on us." The staff was now sent to the various points of the advancing lines, and all was activity in pressing forward the good work. By noon, nearly all the outer line of works was in our possession, except 2 strong redoubts which occupied a commanding position, named respectively Fort Gregg and Fort Whitworth. The general decided that these should be stormed, and about 1 o'clock 3 of Ord's brigades swept down upon Fort Gregg. The garrison of 300 men, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel J. H. Duncan, with 2 rifled cannon, made a desperate defense, and a gallant contest took place. For half an hour after our men had gained the parapet, a bloody hand-to-hand struggle continued, but nothing could stand against the onslaught of Ord's troops, flushed with their morning victory. By 2:30, 57 of the brave garrison lay dead, and the rest had surrendered. Fort Whitworth was abandoned, but the guns of Fort Gregg were opened upon the garrison as they marched out, and the commander, Colonel Joseph M. Jane, and 60 men surrendered. About this time, Miles struck a force of the enemy at Sutherland Station on Lee's extreme right, and captured 2 pieces of artillery and nearly 1,000 prisoners. At 4:40, the general, who had been keeping Mr. Lincoln fully advised of the history that was so rapidly being made that day, sent him a telegram inviting him to come out the next day and pay him a visit. A prompt reply was received from the President saying, "Allow me to tender you and all with you the nation's grateful thanks for the additional and magnificent success. At your kind suggestion, I think I will meet you tomorrow." Prominent officers now urged the general to make an assault on the inner lines and capture Petersburg that afternoon, but he was firm in his resolve not to sacrifice the lives necessary to accomplish such a result. He said the city would undoubtedly be evacuated during the night, and he would dispose the troops for a parallel march westward and try to head off the escaping army. And thus ended this eventful Sunday. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Grant enters Petersburg. Lincoln at Petersburg. In hot pursuit of Lee. Grant makes a night ride to reach Sheridan. Grant hurries on to Farmville. Grant at Farmville. Grant opens a correspondence with Lee. The ride to Curdsville. Grant suffers an attack of illness. More correspondence with Lee. The general was up at daylight the next morning, and the first report brought in was that Parke had gone through the lines at 4 a.m., capturing a few skirmishers, and that the city had surrendered at 4:28 to Colonel Ralph Ely. A second communication surrendering the place was sent in to Wright. General Grant's prediction had been fully verified. The evacuation had begun about 10 the night before, and was completed on the morning of the 3rd. Between 5 and 6 a.m., the general had a conference with Meade, and orders were given to push westward with all haste. About 9 a.m., the general rode into Petersburg. Many of the citizens, panic-stricken, had escaped with the army. Most of the whites who remained stayed indoors. A few groups of Negroes gave cheers, but the scene generally was one of complete desertion. Grant rode along quietly until he came to a comfortable-looking brick house with a yard in front, No. 21 Market Street, the residence of Mr. Thomas Wallace, and here he and the staff dismounted and took seats on the piazza. A number of the citizens now gathered on the sidewalk and stood gazing with eager curiosity upon the features of the commander of the Yankee armies. Soon an officer came with a dispatch from Sheridan, who had been reinforced and ordered to strike out along the Danville Railroad, saying he was already 9 miles beyond Namazine Creek and pressing the enemy's trains. The general was anxious to move westward at once with the leading infantry columns, but he prolonged his stay until the President came up. Mr. Lincoln soon after arrived, accompanied by Robert, who had ridden back to the railroad station to meet him, and by his little son Tad and Admiral Porter. He dismounted in the street and came in through the front gate with long and rapid strides, his face beaming with delight. He seized General Grant's hand as the general stepped forward to greet him, and stood shaking it for some time, and poured out his thanks and congratulations with all the fervor of a heart which seemed overflowing with its fullness of joy. I doubt whether Mr. Lincoln ever experienced a happier moment in his life. The scene was singularly affecting, and one never to be forgotten. He said, "Do you know, General, I had a sort of sneaking idea all along that you intended to do something like this, but I thought some time ago that you would so maneuver as to have Sherman come up and be near enough to cooperate with you." "Yes," replied the general, "I thought at one time that Sherman's army might advance far enough to be in supporting distance of the Eastern armies when the spring campaign against Lee opened, but I had a feeling that it would be better to let Lee's old antagonists give his army the final blow and finish up the job. If the Western troops were even to put in an appearance against Lee's army, it might give some of our politicians a chance to stir up sectional feeling in claiming everything for the troops from their section of country. The Western armies have been very successful in their campaigns, and it is due to the Eastern armies to let them vanquish their old enemy single-handed." I see," said Mr. Lincoln, "but I never thought of it in that light. In fact, my anxiety has been so great that I didn't care where the help came from, so that the work was perfectly done." "Oh," General Grant continued, "I do not suppose it would have given rise to much of the bickering I mentioned, and perhaps the idea would not have occurred to any one else. I feel sure there would have been no such feeling among the soldiers. Of course, I would not have risked the result of the campaign on account of any mere sentiment of this kind. I have always felt confident that our troops here were amply able to handle Lee." Mr. Lincoln then began to talk about the civil complications that would follow the destruction of the Confederate armies in the field, and showed plainly the anxiety he felt regarding the great problems in statecraft which would soon be thrust upon him. He intimated very plainly in a conversation that lasted nearly half an hour that thoughts of leniency to the conquered were uppermost in his heart. Meanwhile, his son Tad, for whom he always showed a deep affection, was becoming a little uneasy, and gave certain appealing looks, to which General Sharp, who seemed to understand the mute expressions of small boys, responded by producing some sandwiches which he offered to him, saying, "Here, young man, I guess you must be hungry." Tad seized them as a drowning man would seize a life-preserver, and cried out, "Yes, I am. That's what's the matter with me." This greatly amused the President and the General-in-Chief, who had a hearty laugh at Tad's expense. A gentleman, whom we suppose was the proprietor of the house, asked the General to go into the parlor, but he declined politely, saying, "Thank you, but I am smoking." The General hoped that before he parted with Mr. Lincoln, he would hear that Richmond was in our possession, but after waiting about an hour and a half, he said he must ride on to the front and join Ord's column, and took leave of the President, who shook his hand cordially and with great warmth of feeling wished him Godspeed and every success. The General and staff had ridden as far as Sutherland Station, about 9 miles, when a dispatch from Weitzel overtook them, which had come by a roundabout way. It read, "We took Richmond at 8:15 this morning. I captured many guns. The enemy left in great haste. The city is on fire in 2 places. I am making every effort to put it out. The people received us with enthusiastic expressions of joy." Although the news was expected, there were loud shouts of rejoicing from the group who heard it read. The General, as usual, did not manifest the slightest sign of emotion, and merely remarked, "I am sorry I did not get this information before we left the President. However, I suppose he has heard it by this time," and then added, "Let the news be circulated among the troops as rapidly as possible." Grant and Meade both went into camp at Sutherland Station that evening, April 3. The Army of the Potomac caught but a few hours' sleep, and at 3 the next morning was again on the march. The pursuit had now become swift, unflagging, relentless. Sheridan, the Inevitable, as the enemy had learned to call him, was in advance, thundering on with his cavalry, followed by Griffin and the rest of the Army of the Potomac, while Ord was swinging along toward Burkeville to head off Lee from Danville, to which point it was naturally supposed he was pushing in order to unite with Joe Johnston's army. April 4 was another active day. The troops were made to realize that this campaign was to be won by legs, that the great walking match had begun, and success depended upon which army could make the best distance record. Grant rode this day with Ord's troops. Meade was quite sick and had to take at times to an ambulance, but his loyal spirit never flagged, and all his orders breathed the true spirit of a soldier. That night General Grant camped at Wilson Station on the South Side Railroad, 27 miles west of Petersburg. A railroad engineer who had been brought in as a prisoner reported that Davis and his cabinet had passed through Burkeville on their way south early on the morning of the day before. The next morning the general sent a dispatch to Sherman in North Carolina, giving him an account of the situation, containing instructions as to his future movements, and winding up with the famous words, "Rebel armies are now the only strategic points to strike at." On the 5th, he marched again with Ord's column, and at noon reached Nottoway Courthouse, about 10 miles east of Burkeville, where he halted with Ord for a couple of hours. A young staff officer here rode up to Ord in a state of considerable excitement and said, "Is this a way station?" The grim old soldier, who was always fond of a quiet joke, replied with great deliberation, "This is not a way station." The staff collected around General Grant on the front porch of the Old Town Tavern, and while examining maps and discussing the movements, a ringing dispatch came in from Sheridan saying he had captured 6 guns and some wagons and had intercepted Lee's advance toward Burkeville, that Lee was in person at Amelia Courthouse, etc. This news was given to the passing troops, and lusty cheers went up from every throat. They had marched about 15 miles already that day, and now struck out as if they were good for 15 more, and vowed that they were going to beat the record of the cavalry. We continued to move along the wagon road, which runs parallel to the South Side Railroad, till nearly dark, and had by that time reached a point about halfway between Nottoway and Burkeville. The road was skirted by a dense woods on the north side, the side toward the enemy. A commotion suddenly arose among the headquarters escort, and on looking around I saw some of our men dashing up to a horseman in full Confederate uniform who had emerged like an apparition from the woods, and in the act of seizing him as a prisoner. I recognized him at once as the scout who had brought the important dispatch sent by Sheridan from Columbia to City Point. I said to him, "How do you do, Campbell?" and told our men he was all right and was one of our people. He said he had had a hard ride from Sheridan's camp and had brought a dispatch for General Grant. By this time the general had also recognized him and had ridden up to him and halted in the road to see what he had brought. Campbell took from his mouth a small pellet of tinfoil, opened it, and pulled out a sheet of tissue paper on which was written the famous dispatch so widely published at the time, in which Sheridan described the situation at Jetersville and added, "I wish you were here yourself." The general said he would go at once to Sheridan, and dismounted from his black pony, Jeff Davis, which he had been riding, and called for his horse, Cincinnati. He stood in the road for a few minutes and wrote a dispatch to Ord, using the pony's back for a desk, and then, mounting the fresh horse, told Campbell to lead the way. It was found that he would have to skirt pretty closely to the enemy's lines, and it was thought that it would be prudent to take some cavalry with us, but there was none near at hand, and the general said he would risk it with our mounted escort of 14 men. Calling upon me and 3 other officers to accompany him, he started off. I had in the meanwhile questioned the scout about the trip, and found that we would have to follow some crossroads through a wooded country and travel nearly 20 miles. It was now dark, but there was enough moonlight to enable us to see the way without difficulty. After riding for nearly 2 hours, the enemy's campfires were seen in the distance, and it was noticed that the fence rails were thrown down in a number of places, indicating that cavalry had been moving across this part of the country, though we were certain our cavalry had not been there. Knowing that scouts are seldom trustworthy and are often in the employ of both sides, and feeling that the general safety was now entirely in the power of a comparatively unknown man, I, for one, began to grow suspicious. Just then Campbell fell back several paces and suddenly turned his horse into a piece of woods which we were skirting, and seemed to be acting in a manner that indicated either confusion or treachery. I cocked my pistol and rode close behind him, thinking his feelings would stand that much in the way of precaution anyhow, and determined that if he was caught giving any suspicious signals, I would at once arrest him. The scout, however, was thoroughly loyal and one of Sheridan's most trusted men. No thought of treachery had crossed his mind. He was only looking for a short cut through the woods. About 10:30 we struck Sheridan's pickets. They could hardly be made to understand that the General-in-Chief was wandering about at that hour with so small an escort, and so near to the enemy's lines. The cavalry were sleeping on their arms, and as our little party picked its way through their ranks, and the troopers woke up and recognized the general in the moonlight, their remarks were highly characteristic of the men. One said, "Why, there's the old man. Boys, this means business." And another, "Great Scott, the old chief's out here himself. The Rebs are going to get busted tomorrow, certain." And a third, "Uncle Sam's joined the cavalry sure enough. You can bet there'll be lively times here in the morning." Sheridan was awaiting us, feeling sure that the general would come after getting his dispatch. A good supper of beef, cold chicken, and coffee was soon prepared, and it was quickly demonstrated that the night ride had not impaired anyone's appetite. When the General-in-Chief had learned fully the situation in Sheridan's front, he first sent a message to Ord to watch the roads running south from Burkeville and Farmville, and then went over to Meade's camp nearby. Meade was lying down and still suffering from illness. His views differed somewhat from General Grant's regarding the movements of the Army of the Potomac for the next day, and the latter changed the dispositions that were being made so as to have the army unite with Sheridan's troops in swinging round more toward the south and heading off Lee in that direction. The next day, April 6, proved a decided field day in the pursuit. It was found in the morning that Lee had retreated during the night from Amelia Courthouse, and from the direction he had taken, and information received that he had ordered rations to meet him at Farmville, it was seen that he had abandoned all hope of reaching Burkeville and was probably heading for Lynchburg. Ord was to try to burn the high bridge over the Appomattox and pushed on to Farmville. Sheridan's cavalry was to work round Lee's left flank, and the Army of the Potomac was to make another forced march and strike the enemy wherever it could reach him. I spent a portion of the day with Humphreys' corps, which attacked the enemy near Deatonsville and gave his rear guard no rest. I joined General Grant later and rode with him to Burkeville, getting there some time after dark. Ord had pushed out to Rice's Station, and Sheridan and Wright had gone in against the enemy and fought the Battle of Sailor's Creek, capturing 6 general officers and about 7,000 men, and smashing things generally. General Grant broke camp and started from Burkeville early the next morning, the 7th, and moved rapidly in the direction of Farmville. The columns were crowding the roads, and the men, aroused to still greater efforts by the inspiriting news of the day before, were sweeping steadily along, despite the rain that fell like trained pedestrians on a walking track. As the general rode among them, he was greeted with shouts and hurrahs on all sides, and a string of sly remarks which showed how familiar swords and bayonets become when victory furnishes the topic of their talk, such as, "Cavalry's skin out, General. Infantry's going to crush the rest of the mud," and "We've marched nigh 20 miles on this stretch, and we're good for 20 more if the General says so," and "We're not straddling any hosses, but we'll get there all the same." The general raised his hat in acknowledgment of the cheers and gave a pleasant nod to each of the men who addressed him. A little before noon on April 7, 1865, General Grant with his staff rode into the little village of Farmville on the south side of the Appomattox River, a town that will be memorable in history as the place where he opened a correspondence with Lee, which 2 days later led to the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. He drew up in front of the village hotel, a comfortable brick building, dismounted, and established headquarters on its broad piazza. News came in that Crook was fighting large odds with his cavalry on the north side of the river, and I was directed to go to his front and see what was necessary to be done to assist him. I found that he was being driven back, the enemy, Mumford's and Rosser's cavalry divisions under Fitzhugh Lee, having made a bold stand north of the river. Humphreys was also on the north side, isolated from the rest of our infantry, confronted by a large portion of Lee's army, and having some heavy fighting. On my return to general headquarters that evening, Wright's corps was ordered to cross the river and move rapidly to the support of our troops there. Notwithstanding their long march that day, the men sprang to their feet with a spirit that made everyone marvel at their pluck, and came swinging through the main street of the village with a step that seemed as elastic as on the first day of their toilsome tramp. It was now dark, but they spied the general-in-chief watching them with evident pride from the piazza of the hotel as they marched past. Then was witnessed one of the most inspiring scenes of the campaign. Bonfires were lighted on the sides of the streets. The men seized straw and pine knots and improvised torches. Cheers arose from their throats, already hoarse with shouts of victory. Bands played, banners waved, and muskets were swung in the air. A regiment now broke forth with the song of John Brown's Body, and soon a whole division was shouting the swelling chorus of that popular air, which had risen to the dignity of a national anthem. The night march had become a grand review, with Grant as the reviewing officer. Ord and Gibbon had visited the general at the hotel, and he had spoken with them, as well as with Wright, about sending some communication to Lee that might pave the way to the stopping of further bloodshed. Dr. Smith, formerly of the regular army, a native of Virginia, and a relative of General Ewell, now one of our prisoners, had told General Grant the night before that Ewell had said in conversation that their cause was lost when they crossed the James River, and he considered that it was the duty of the authorities to negotiate for peace then, while they still had a right to claim concessions, adding that now they were not in condition to claim anything. He said that for every man killed after this, somebody would be responsible, and it would be little better than murder. He could not tell what General Lee would do, but he hoped that he would at once surrender his army. This statement, together with the news that had been received from Sheridan, saying that he had heard that General Lee's trains of provisions, which had come by rail, were at Appomattox, and that he expected to capture them before Lee could reach them, induced the general to write the following communication. Headquarters, Armies of the U.S., 5 p.m., April 7, 1865. General R. E. Lee, commanding C.S.A. The results of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusions of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate States Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. This he entrusted to General Seth Williams, Adjutant General, with directions to take it to Humphreys front, as his corps was close up to the enemy's rear guard, and see that it reached Lee. Williams's orderly was shot, and he himself came near losing his life in getting this communication through the lines. General Grant decided to remain all night at Farmville and await the reply from Lee, and he was shown to a room in the hotel in which he was told that Lee had slept the night before, although this statement could not be verified. Lee wrote the following reply within an hour after he received General Grant's letter, but it was brought in by a rather circuitous route and did not reach its destination till after midnight. April 7, 1865. General, I have received your note of this date. Though not entertaining the opinion you express of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia, I reciprocate your desire to avoid useless effusion of blood, and therefore, before considering your proposition, ask the terms you will offer on condition of its surrender. R. E. Lee, General. Lieutenant General U.S. Grant, Commanding Armies of the U.S. The next morning, before leaving Farmville, the following reply was given to General Seth Williams, who again went to Humphreys front to have it transmitted to Lee. April 8, 1865, General R. E. Lee, commanding C.S.A. Your note of last evening, in reply to mine of the same date, asking the conditions on which I will accept the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, is just received. In reply would say that peace being my great desire, there is but one condition I would insist upon, namely that the men and officers surrendered shall be disqualified for taking up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged. I will meet you, or will designate officers to meet any officers you may name for the same purpose, at any point agreeable to you, for the purpose of arranging definitely the terms upon which the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia will be received. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. The last sentence shows great delicacy of feeling on the part of General Grant, who wished to spare General Lee the mortification of personally conducting the surrender. The consideration displayed has a parallel in the terms accorded by Washington to Cornwallis at Yorktown. Cornwallis took advantage of the privilege and sent O'Hara to represent him, but Lee rose superior to the British general and in a manly way came and conducted the surrender in person. There turned up at this time a rather hungry-looking gentleman in gray, wearing the uniform of a colonel, who proclaimed himself the proprietor of the hotel. He gave us to understand that his regiment had crumbled to pieces, that he was about the only portion of it that had succeeded in holding together, and he thought he might as well stop off at home and look after his property. It is safe to say that his hotel had never before had so many guests in it, nor at such reduced rates. His story was significant as indicating the disintegrating process which was going on in the ranks of the enemy. General Grant had been marching most of the way with the columns which were pushing along south of Lee's line of retreat, but expecting that a reply to his last letter would soon be received, and wanting to keep within easy communication with Lee, he decided to march that day with the portion of the Army of the Potomac that was pressing Lee's rear guard. After issuing some further instructions to Ord and Sheridan, he started from Farmville, crossed to the north side of the Appomattox, conferred in person with Meade, and rode with his columns. Encouraging reports came in all day, and that night headquarters were established at Curdsville in a large white farmhouse a few hundred yards from Meade's camp. The general and several of the staff had cut loose from the headquarters trains the night he started to meet Sheridan at Jetersville, and had neither baggage nor camp equipage. The general did not even have his sword with him. This was the most advanced effort yet made in moving in light marching order, and we billeted ourselves at night in farmhouses or bivouacked on porches and picked up meals at any camp that seemed to have something to spare in the way of rations. That night we sampled the fare of Meade's hospitable mess, and once more lay down with full stomachs. General Grant had been suffering all the afternoon from a severe headache, the result of fatigue, anxiety, scant fare, and loss of sleep, and by night he grew much worse. He was induced to bathe his feet in hot water and mustard, and apply mustard plasters to his wrists and the back of his neck, but these remedies afforded little relief. The dwelling we occupied was a double house. The general threw himself upon a sofa in the sitting-room on the left side of the hall, while the staff officers bunked on the floor of the room opposite to catch what sleep they could. About midnight we were aroused by Colonel Charles A. Whittier of Humphreys's staff, who brought the expected letter from Lee. Rawlins took it and stepped across the hall to the door of General Grant's room. He hesitated to knock, not wishing to awake the commander if he were asleep, and opened the door softly and listened a moment to ascertain whether he could judge by any sound how the chief was resting. Soon the general's voice was heard saying, "Come in, I am awake. I am suffering too much to get any sleep." I had in the meantime brought a lighted candle, and now stepped into the room with it. The general, who had taken off only his coat and boots, sat up on the sofa and read the communication. The letter was as follows: April 8, 1865. General, I received at a late hour your note of today. In mine of yesterday I did not intend to propose the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, but to ask the terms of your proposition. To be frank, I do not think the emergency has arisen to call for the surrender of this army. But as the restoration of peace should be the sole object of all, I desired to know whether your proposals would lead to that end. I cannot therefore meet you with a view to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia, But as far as your proposal may affect the Confederate States forces under my command and tend to the restoration of peace, I shall be pleased to meet you at 10 a.m. tomorrow on the old stage road to Richmond between the picket lines of the two armies. R. E. Lee, General, to Lieutenant General U.S. Grant. The general shook his head, expressive of his disappointment, and remarked, "It looks as if Lee still means to fight. I will reply in the morning," and after making a few more comments, lay down again upon the sofa. Rawlins and I expressed the hope that the general might still be able to get some sleep, and then retired from the room. About 4 o'clock in the morning of April 9, I rose and crossed the hall to ascertain how the general was feeling. I found his room empty, and upon going out of the front door, saw him pacing up and down in the yard, holding both hands to his head. Upon inquiring how he felt, he replied that he had had very little sleep, and was still suffering the most excruciating pain. I said, "Well, there is one consolation in all this, General. I never knew you to be ill that you did not receive some good news before the day passed. I have become a little superstitious regarding these coincidences, and I should not be surprised if some good fortune were to overtake you before night." He smiled and replied, "The best thing that could happen to me today would be to get rid of the pain I am suffering." We were soon joined by some others of the staff, and the general was induced to walk over to Meade's headquarters with us and get some coffee, in the hope that it would do him good. He seemed to feel a little better then, and after writing the following letter to Lee and dispatching it, he prepared to move forward. April 9, 1865. General, your note of yesterday is received. As I have no authority to treat on the subject of peace, the meeting proposed for 10 a.m. today could lead to no good. I will state, however, General, that I am equally anxious for peace with yourself, and the whole North entertains the same feeling. The terms upon which peace can be had are well understood. By the South laying down their arms, they will hasten that most desirable event, save thousands of human lives and hundreds of millions of property not yet destroyed. Sincerely hoping that all our difficulties may be settled without the loss of another life, I subscribe myself, and etc., U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. To General R. E. Lee. General Grant kept steadily in mind the fact that he was simply a soldier and could deal only with hostile armies. He could not negotiate a treaty of peace without transcending his authority. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. Grant's ride to Appomattox, how Lee reached McLean's house, meeting between Grant and Lee, brief discussion as to the terms of surrender, drafting the terms and the acceptance, Grant's consideration for the Confederate privates, rations for the paroled army. It was proposed to the general to ride during the day in a covered ambulance which was at hand instead of on horseback, so as to avoid the intense heat of the sun, but his soldierly instincts rebelled against such a proposition, and he soon after mounted Cincinnati and started from Curdsville toward New Store. From this point he went by way of a crossroad to the south side of the Appomattox with the intention of moving around to Sheridan's front. While riding along the wagon road which runs from Farmville to Appomattox Courthouse at a point 8 or 9 miles east of the latter place, General Charles E. Pease of Meade's staff overtook him with a dispatch. It was found to be a reply from Lee which had been sent into our lines on Humphreys' front. It read as follows: April 9, 1865. General, I received your note of this morning on the picket line, whither I had come to meet you and ascertain definitely what terms were embraced in your proposal of yesterday with reference to the surrender of this army. I now request an interview in accordance with the offer contained in your letter of yesterday for that purpose. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, R. E. Lee, General, Lieutenant General, U.S. Grant, commanding U.S. Armies. Pease also brought a note from Meade saying that at Lee's request he had read the communication addressed to Grant and in consequence of it had granted a short truce. The general, as soon as he had read these letters, dismounted, sat down on the grassy bank by the roadside, and wrote the following reply to Lee. April 9, 1865. General R. E. Lee, commanding C.S. Army. Your note of this day is but this moment, 11:50 a.m., received in consequence of my having passed from the Richmond and Lynchburg road to the Farmville and Lynchburg road. I am at this writing about 4 miles west of Walker's Church, and will push forward to the front for the purpose of meeting you. Notice sent to me on this road where you wish the interview to take place will meet me. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. He handed this to Colonel Babcock of the staff, with directions to take it to General Lee by the most direct route. Mounting his horse again, the general rode on at a trot toward Appomattox Courthouse. When 5 or 6 miles from the town, Colonel Newell, Sheridan's adjutant general, came riding up from the direction of Appomattox and handed the general a communication. This proved to be a duplicate of the letter from Lee that Lieutenant Pease had brought in from Meade's lines. Lee was so closely pressed that he was anxious to communicate with Grant by the most direct means, and as he could not tell with which column Grant was moving, he sent in one copy of his letter on Meade's front and one on Sheridan's. Colonel Newhall joined our party, and after a few minutes' halt to read the letter, we continued our ride toward Appomattox. On the march I had asked the general several times how he felt. To the same question now he replied, "The pain in my head seemed to leave me the moment I got Lee's letter." The road was filled with men, animals, and wagons, and to avoid these and shorten the distance, we turned slightly to the right and began to cut across lots. But before going far, we spied men conspicuous in gray, and it was seen that we were moving toward the enemy's left flank, and that a short ride farther would take us into his lines. It looked for a moment as if a very awkward condition of things might possibly arise, and Grant become a prisoner in Lee's lines instead of Lee in his. Such a circumstance would have given rise to an important cross-country in the system of campaign bookkeeping. There was only one remedy, to retrace our steps and strike the right road, which was done without serious discussion. About 1 o'clock, the little village of Appomattox Courthouse, with its half-dozen houses, came in sight, and soon we were entering its single street. It is situated on rising ground, and beyond it the country slopes down into a broad valley. The enemy was seen with his columns and wagon trains covering the low ground. Our cavalry, the 5th Corps, and part of Ord's command were occupying the high ground to the south and west of the enemy, heading him off completely. We saw a group of officers who had dismounted and were standing at the edge of the town, and at their head we soon recognized the features of Sheridan. No one could look at Sheridan at such a moment without a sentiment of undisguised admiration. In this campaign, as in others, he had shown himself possessed of military traits of the highest order. Bold in conception, self-reliant, demonstrating by his acts that much danger makes great hearts most resolute, fertile in resources, combining the restlessness of a Hotspur with the patience of a Fabius, it is no wonder that he should have been looked upon as the wizard of the battlefield. Generous of his life, gifted with the ingenuity of a Hannibal, the dash of a Marat, the courage of a Ney, the magnetism of his presence roused his troops to deeds of individual heroism, and his unconquerable columns rushed to victory with all the confidence of Caesar's 10th Legion. Wherever blows fell thickest, there was his crest. Despite the valor of the defense, opposing ranks went down before the fierceness of his onsets, never to rise again, and he would not pause till the folds of his banners waved above the strongholds he had wrested from the foe. Brave Sheridan! I can almost see him now, his silent clay again quickened into life, once more riding Rienzi through a fire of hell, leaping opposing earthworks at a single bound, and leaving nothing of those who barred his way except the fragments scattered in his path. As long as manly courage is talked of, or heroic deeds are honored, the hearts of a grateful people will beat responsive to the mention of the talismanic name of Sheridan. Ord and others were standing in the group before us, and as our party came up, General Grant greeted the officers and said, "How are you, Sheridan?" "First rate, thank you. How are you?" cried Sheridan, with a voice and look which seemed to indicate that on his part he was having things all his own way. "Is Lee over there?" asked Grant, pointing up the road, having heard a rumor that Lee was in that vicinity. "Yes, he is in that brick house waiting to surrender to you," answered Sheridan. "Well, then, we'll go over," said Grant. The general-in-chief now rode on, accompanied by Sheridan, Ord, and others. Soon Colonel Babcock's orderly was seen sitting on his horse in the street in front of a 2-story brick house, better in appearance than the rest of the houses. He said General Lee and Colonel Babcock had gone into this house half an hour before, and he was ordered to post himself in the street and keep a lookout for General Grant, so as to let him know where General Lee was. Babcock told me afterward that in carrying General Grant's last letter, he passed through the enemy's lines and found General Lee a little more than half a mile beyond Appomattox Courthouse. He was lying down by the roadside on a blanket which had been spread over a few fence rails placed on the ground under an apple tree which was part of an old orchard. This circumstance furnished the only ground for the widespread report that the surrender occurred under an apple tree, and which has been repeated in song and story. There may be said of that statement what Cuvier said of the French Academy's definition of a crab, brilliant but not correct. Babcock dismounted upon coming near, and as he approached, Lee sat up, with his feet hanging over the roadside embankment. The wheels of wagons in passing along the road had cut away the earth of this embankment and left the roots of the trees projecting. Lee's feet were partly resting on these roots. Colonel Charles Marshall, his military secretary, came forward, took the dispatch which Babcock handed him, and gave it to General Lee. After reading it, the general rose and said he would ride forward on the road on which Babcock had come, but was apprehensive that hostilities might begin in the meantime upon the termination of the temporary truce, and asked Babcock to write a line to Meade informing him of the situation. Babcock wrote accordingly, requesting Meade to maintain the truce until positive orders from Grant could be received. To save time, it was arranged that a Union officer, accompanied by one of Lee's officers, should carry this letter through the enemy's lines. This route made the distance to Meade nearly 10 miles shorter than by the roundabout way of the Union lines. Lee now mounted his horse and directed Colonel Marshall to accompany him. They started for Appomattox Courthouse in company with Babcock, followed by a mounted orderly. When the party reached the village, they met one of its residents named Wilmer McLean, who was told that General Lee wished to occupy a convenient room in some house in the town. McLean ushered them into the sitting room of one of the first houses he came to, but upon looking about and seeing that it was small and unfurnished, Lee proposed finding something more commodious and better fitted for the occasion. McLean then conducted the party to his own house, about the best one in the town, where they awaited General Grant's arrival. The house had a comfortable wooden porch with 7 steps leading up to it. A hall ran through the middle from front to back, and upon each side was a room having 2 windows, one in front and one in rear. Each room had 2 doors opening into the hall. The building stood a little distance back from the street, with a yard in front, and to the left, on entering, was a gate for carriages and a roadway running to a stable in rear. We entered the grounds by this gate and dismounted. In the yard were seen a fine, large, gray horse, which proved to be General Lee's favorite animal, named Traveler, and a good-looking, dark-colored mare belonging to Colonel Marshall. An orderly in gray was in charge of them and had taken off their bridles to let them crop the grass. General Grant mounted the steps and entered the house. As he stepped into the hall, Colonel Babcock, who had seen his approach from the window, opened the door of the room on the left, in which he had been sitting with General Lee and Colonel Marshall, awaiting General Grant's arrival. The general passed in, and as Lee arose and stepped forward, Grant extended his hand, saying, "General Lee," and the two shook hands cordially. The members of the staff, General Sheridan and Ord, and some other general officers who had gathered in the front yard, remained outside, feeling that General Grant would probably prefer his first interview with General Lee to be, in a measure, private. In a few minutes, Colonel Babcock came to the front door, and making a motion with his hat toward the sitting-room, said, "The General says come in." It was then about 1:30 on Sunday, the 9th of April. We entered and found General Grant seated in an old office armchair in the center of the room, and Lee sitting in a plain armchair with a cane seat beside a square, marble-topped table near the front window, in the corner opposite the door by which we entered, and facing General Grant. Colonel Marshall was standing at his left, with his right elbow resting upon the mantelpiece. We walked in softly and ranged ourselves quietly about the sides of the room, very much as people enter a sick chamber when they expect to find the patient dangerously ill. Some found seats on the sofa standing against the wall between the two doors and on the few plain chairs which constituted the furniture, but most of the party stood. The contrast between the two commanders was singularly striking, and could not fail to attract marked attention as they sat, 6 or 8 feet apart, facing each other. General Grant, then nearly 43 years of age, was 5 feet 8 inches in height, with shoulders slightly stooped. His hair and full beard were nut brown, without a trace of gray in them. He had on his single-breasted blouse of dark blue flannel, unbuttoned in front and showing a waistcoat underneath. He wore an ordinary pair of top boots, with his trousers inside, and was without spurs. The boots and portions of his clothes were spattered with mud. He had worn a pair of thread gloves of a dark yellow color, which he had taken off on entering the room. His felt sugar-loaf, stiff-brimmed hat was resting on his lap. He had no sword or sash, and a pair of shoulder-straps was all there was about him to designate his rank. In fact, aside from these, his uniform was that of a private soldier. Lee, on the other hand, was 6 feet and 1 inch in height, and erect for one of his age, for he was Grant's senior by 16 years. His hair and full beard were a silver gray and thick, except that the hair had become a little thin in front. He wore a new uniform of Confederate gray, buttoned to the throat, and a handsome sword and sash. The sword was of exceedingly fine workmanship, and the hilt was studded with jewels. It had been presented to him by some ladies in England who sympathized with the cause he represented. His top boots were comparatively new, and had on them near the top some ornamental stitching of red silk. Like his uniform, they were clean. On the boots were handsome spurs with large rowels. A felt hat, which in color matched pretty closely that of his uniform, and a pair of long gray buckskin gauntlets lay beside him on the table. We endeavored afterward to learn how it was that he wore such fine clothes, and looked so much as if he had turned out to go to church that Sunday afternoon, while with us our outward garb scarcely rose to the dignity even of the shabby genteel. One explanation was that when his headquarters wagons had been pressed so closely by our cavalry a few days before, it was found that his officers would have to destroy all their baggage except the clothes they carried on their backs, and each one naturally selected the newest suit he had, and sought to propitiate the god of destruction by a sacrifice of his second best. Another reason given was that, in deference to General Grant, General Lee had dressed himself with special care for the purpose of the meeting. Grant began the conversation by saying, "I met you once before, General Lee, while we were serving in Mexico, when you came over from General Scott's headquarters to visit Garland's brigade, to which I then belonged. I have always remembered your appearance, and I think I should have recognized you anywhere." "Yes," replied General Lee, "I know I met you on that occasion, and I have often thought of it and tried to recollect how you looked, but I have never been able to recall a single feature." After some further mention of Mexico, General Lee said, "I suppose, General Grant, that the object of our present meeting is fully understood. I asked to see you to ascertain upon what terms you would receive the surrender of my army." General Grant replied, The terms I propose are those stated substantially in my letter of yesterday. That is, the officers and men surrendered to be paroled and disqualified from taking up arms again until properly exchanged, and all arms, ammunition, and supplies to be delivered up as captured property. Lee nodded an assent and said, "Those are about the conditions which I expected would be proposed." General Grant then continued, "Yes, I think our correspondence indicated pretty clearly the action that would be taken at our meeting, and I hope it may lead to a general suspension of hostilities and be the means of preventing any further loss of life." Lee inclined his head as indicating his accord with this wish, and General Grant then went on to talk at some length in a very pleasant vein about the prospects of peace. Lee was evidently anxious to proceed to the formal work of the surrender, and he brought the subject up again by saying, "I presume, General Grant, we have both carefully considered the proper steps to be taken, and I would suggest that you commit to writing the terms you have proposed so that they may be formally acted upon." "Very well," replied Grant, "I will write them out." And calling for his manifold order book, he opened it, laid it on a small oval wooden table which Colonel Parker brought to him from the rear of the room, and proceeded to write the terms. The leaves had been so prepared that 3 impressions of the writing were made. He wrote very rapidly, and did not pause until he had finished the sentence ending with "officers appointed by me to receive them." Then he looked toward Lee, and his eyes seemed to be resting on the handsome sword that hung at that officer's side. He said afterward that this set him to thinking that it would be an unnecessary humiliation to require the officers to surrender their swords, and a great hardship to deprive them of their personal baggage and horses. And after a short pause he wrote the sentence, "This will not embrace the side arms of the officers, nor their private horses or baggage." When he had finished the letter, he called Colonel Parker to his side and looked it over with him, and directed him as they went along to interline 6 or 7 words, and to strike out the word "there," which had been repeated. When this had been done, the general took the manifold writer in his right hand, extended his arm toward Lee, and started to rise from his chair to hand the book to him. As I was standing equally distant from them, with my back to the front window, I stepped forward, took the book, and passed it to General Lee. The terms were as follows: Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, April 9, 1865. General R.E. Lee, commanding C.S.A. General: In accordance with the substance of my letter to you of the 8th instant, I propose to receive the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia on the following terms, to wit: rolls of all the officers and men to be made in duplicate, 1 copy to be given to an officer to be designated by me, the other to be retained by such officer or officers as you may designate. The officers to give their individual paroles not to take up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged, and each company or regimental commander to sign a like parole for the men of their commands. The arms, artillery, and public property to be parked and stacked and turned over to the officers appointed by me to receive them. This will not embrace the side arms of the officers, nor their private horses or baggage. This done, each officer and man will be allowed to return to his home, not to be disturbed by the United States authorities so long as they observe their paroles and the laws in force where they may reside. Very respectfully, U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. Lee pushed aside some books and 2 brass candlesticks which were on the table, then took the book and laid it down before him, while he drew from his pocket a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles and wiped the glasses carefully with his handkerchief. He crossed his legs, adjusted the spectacles very slowly and deliberately, took up the draft of the terms, and proceeded to read them attentively. They consisted of 2 pages. When he reached the top line of the 2nd page, he looked up and said to General Grant, "After the words 'until properly,' the word 'exchanged' seems to be omitted. You doubtless intended to use that word." "Why, yes," said Grant, "I thought I had put in the word 'exchanged.'" "I presumed it had been omitted inadvertently," continued Lee, "and with your permission I will mark where it should be inserted." "Certainly," Grant replied. Lee felt in his pocket as if searching for a pencil, but he did not seem to be able to find one. Seeing this, I handed him my lead pencil. During the rest of the interview, he kept twirling this pencil in his fingers and occasionally tapping the top of the table with it. When he handed it back, it was carefully treasured by me as a memento of the occasion. When Lee came to the sentence about the officers' sidearms, private horses, and baggage, he showed for the first time during the reading of the letter a slight change of countenance, and was evidently touched by this act of generosity. It was doubtless the condition mentioned to which he particularly alluded when he looked toward General Grant as he finished reading, and said with some degree of warmth in his manner, "This will have a very happy effect upon my army." General Grant then said, "Unless you have some suggestions to make in regard to the form in which I have stated the terms, I will have a copy of the letter made in ink and sign it." "There is one thing I should like to mention," Lee replied after a short pause. "The cavalrymen and artilleries own their own horses in our army. Its organization in this respect differs from that of the United States." This expression attracted the notice of our officers present, as showing how firmly the conviction was grounded in his mind that we were two distinct countries. He continued, "I should like to understand whether these men will be permitted to retain their horses." "You will find that the terms as written do not allow this," General Grant replied. "Only the officers are permitted to take their private property." Lee read over the second page of the letter again and then said, "No, I see the terms do not allow it. That is clear." His face showed plainly that he was quite anxious to have this concession made, and Grant said very promptly and without giving Lee time to make a direct request, "Well, the subject is quite new to me. Of course, I did not know that any private soldiers owned their animals, but I think we have fought the last battle of the war. I sincerely hope so, and that the surrender of this army will be followed soon by that of all the others. And I take it that most of the men in the ranks are small farmers, and as the country has been so raided by the two armies, it is doubtful whether they will be able to put in a crop to carry themselves and their families through the next winter without the aid of the horses they are now riding, and I will arrange it in this way. I will not change the terms as now written, but I will instruct the officers I shall appoint to receive the paroles to let all the men who claim to own a horse or mule take the animals home with them to work their little farms." This expression has been quoted in various forms and has been the subject of some dispute. I give the exact words used. Lee now looked greatly relieved, and though anything but a demonstrative man, he gave every evidence of his appreciation of this concession and said, "This will have the best possible effect upon the men. It will be very gratifying and will do much toward conciliating our people." He handed the draft of the terms back to General Grant, who called Colonel T.S. Bowers of the staff to him and directed him to make a copy in ink. Bowers was a little nervous, and he turned the matter over to Colonel Parker, whose handwriting presented a better appearance than that of anyone else on the staff. Parker sat down to write at the oval table, which he had moved again to the rear of the room. Wilmer McLean's domestic resources in the way of ink now became the subject of a searching investigation, but it was found that the contents of the conical-shaped stoneware inkstand with a paper stopper, which he produced, appeared to be participating in the general breaking up and had disappeared. Colonel Marshall now came to the rescue and took from his pocket a small boxwood inkstand, which was put at Parker's service, so that, after all, we had to fall back upon the resources of the enemy to furnish the stage properties for the final scene in the memorable military drama. Colonel Marshall then took a seat on the sofa beside Sheridan and Ingalls. When the terms had been copied, Lee directed his military secretary to draw up for his signature a letter of acceptance. Colonel Marshall wrote out a draft of such a letter, making it formal, beginning with, "I have the honor to acknowledge," etc. General Lee took it, and after reading it over very carefully, directed that these formal expressions be stricken out and that the letter be otherwise shortened. He afterwards went over it again and seemed to change some words, and then told the colonel to make a final copy in ink. When it came to providing the paper, it was found that we had the only supply of that important ingredient in the recipe for surrendering an army, so we gave a few pages to the colonel. The letter, when completed, read as follows. Headquarters, Army of Northern Virginia, April 9, 1865. General, I have received your letter of this date containing the terms of the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia as proposed by you. As they are substantially the same as those expressed in your letter of the 8th instant, they are accepted. I will proceed to designate the proper officers to carry the stipulations into effect. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, R.E. Lee, General, Lieutenant General U.S. Grant, commanding armies of the U.S. While the letters were being copied, General Grant introduced the general officers who had entered and each member of the staff to General Lee. The general shook hands with General Seth Williams, who had been his adjutant when Lee was superintendent at West Point some years before the war, and gave his hand to some of the other officers who had extended theirs. But to most of those who were introduced, he merely bowed in a dignified and formal manner. He did not exhibit the slightest change of features during this ceremony until Colonel Parker of our staff was presented to him. Parker, being a full-blooded Indian, when Lee saw his swarthy features, he looked at him with evident surprise, and his eyes rested on him for several seconds. What was passing in his mind no one knew, but the natural surmise was that he at first mistook Parker for a Negro and was struck with astonishment to find that the commander of the Union armies had one of that race on his personal staff. Lee did not utter a word while the introductions were going on, except to Seth Williams, with whom he talked cordially. Williams at one time referred in a rather jocose manner to a circumstance which had occurred during their former service together, as if he wished to say something in a good-natured way to thaw the frigidity of the conversation, but Lee was in no mood for pleasantries, and he did not unbend or even relax the fixed sternness of his features. His only response to the remark was a slight inclination of the head. General Lee now took the initiative again in leading the conversation back into business channels. He said, I have 1,000 or more of your men as prisoners, General Grant, a number of them officers, whom we have required to march along with us for several days. I shall be glad to send them into your lines as soon as it can be arranged, for I have no provisions for them. I have, indeed, nothing for my own men. They have been living for the last few days principally upon parched corn, and we are badly in need of both rations and forage. I telegraphed to Lynchburg directing several trainloads of rations to be sent on by rail from there, and when they arrive I should be glad to have the present wants of my men supplied from them. At this remark all eyes turned toward Sheridan, for he had captured these trains with his cavalry the night before near Appomattox Station. General Grant replied, I should like to have our men sent within our lines as soon as possible. I will take steps at once to have your army supplied with rations, but I am sorry to have no forage for the animals. We have had to depend upon the country for our supply of forage. Of about how many men does your present force consist? Indeed, I am not able to say, Lee answered after a slight pause. My losses in killed and wounded have been exceedingly heavy, and besides there have been many stragglers and some deserters. All my reports and public papers, and indeed some of my own private letters, had to be destroyed on the march to prevent them from falling into the hands of your people. Many companies are entirely without officers, and I have not seen any returns for several days, so that I have no means of ascertaining our present strength. General Grant had taken great pains to have a daily estimate made of the enemy's forces from all the data that could be obtained, and judging it to be about 25,000 at that time, he said, Suppose I send over 25,000 rations, do you think that will be a sufficient supply? I think it will be ample, replied Lee, and added with considerable earnestness of manner, and it will be a great relief, I assure you. General Grant now turned to his chief commissary, Colonel M.R. Morgan, who was present, and directed him to arrange for issuing the rations. The number of officers and men surrendered was over 28,000. As to General Grant's supplies, he had ordered the army, on starting out, to carry 12 days' rations. This was the 12th and last day of the campaign. Grant's eye now fell upon Lee's sword again, and it seemed to remind him of the absence of his own, and by way of explanation, and so that it could not be construed as a discourtesy, he said to Lee, "I started out from my camp several days ago without my sword, and as I have not seen my headquarters baggage since, I have been riding about without any sidearms. I have generally worn a sword, however, as little as possible, only during the active operations of a campaign." "I am in the habit of wearing mine most of the time," remarked Lee, "when I am among my troops moving about through the army." General Sheridan now stepped up to General Lee and said that when he discovered some of the Confederate troops in motion during the morning, which seemed to be a violation of the truce, he had sent him, Lee, a couple of notes protesting against this act, and as he had not had time to copy them, he would like to have them long enough to make copies. Lee took the notes out of the breast pocket of his coat and handed them to Sheridan, with a few words expressive of regret that the circumstances should have occurred, and intimating that it must have been the result of some misunderstanding. After a little general conversation had been indulged in by those present, the two letters were signed. Grant signed the terms on the oval table, which was moved up to him again for the purpose. Lee signed his letter of acceptance on the marble-topped table at which he sat. Colonel Parker folded up the terms and gave them to Colonel Marshall. Marshall handed Lee's acceptance to Parker. End of Chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. After the surrender, Grant's final conference with Lee, the dawn of peace, Grant avoids a visit to Richmond, his respect for religion, Grant's enthusiastic reception at Washington, his last interview with Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth shadows Grant, Grant's interrupted journey, Lincoln's assassination. Before parting, Lee asked Grant to notify Meade of the surrender, fearing that fighting might break out on that front and lives be uselessly lost. This request was complied with, and 2 Union officers were sent through the enemy's lines as the shortest route to Meade, some of Lee's officers accompanying them to prevent their being interfered with. A little before 4 o'clock, General Lee shook hands with General Grant, bowed to the other officers, and with Colonel Marshall left the room. One after another we followed, and passed out to the porch. Lee signaled to his orderly to bring up his horse, and while the animal was being bridled, the general stood on the lowest step and gazed sadly in the direction of the valley beyond, where his army lay, now an army of prisoners. He thrice smote the palm of his left hand slowly with his right fist in an absent sort of way, seemed not to see the group of Union officers in the yard, who rose respectfully at his approach and appeared unaware of everything about him. All appreciated the sadness that overwhelmed him, and he had the personal sympathy of every one who beheld him at this supreme moment of trial. The approach of his horse seemed to recall him from his reverie, and he at once mounted. General Grant now stepped down from the porch, moving toward him, and saluted him by raising his hat. He was followed in this act of courtesy by all our officers present. Lee raised his hat respectfully and rode off at a slow trot to break the sad news to the brave fellows whom he had so long commanded. General Grant and his staff then started for the headquarters camp, which in the meantime had been pitched nearby. The news of the surrender had reached the Union lines, and the firing of salutes began at several points, but the general sent an order at once to have them stopped, using these words: "The war is over, the rebels are our countrymen again, and the best sign of rejoicing after the victory will be to abstain from all demonstrations in the field." This was in keeping with his order issued after the surrender of Vicksburg. The paroled prisoners will be sent out of here tomorrow. Instruct commanders to be orderly and quiet as these prisoners pass, and to make no offensive remarks. There were present in the room in which the surrender occurred, besides Sheridan, Ord, Merritt, Custer, and the officers of Grant's staff, a number of other officers and one or two citizens who entered the room at different times during the interview. Mr. McLean had been charging about in a manner which indicated that the excitement was shaking his nervous system to its center. But his real trials did not begin until the departure of the chief actors in the surrender. Then the relic hunters charged down upon the manor house and began to bargain for the numerous pieces of furniture. Sheridan paid the proprietor $20 in gold for the table on which General Grant wrote the terms of surrender, for the purpose of presenting it to Mrs. Custer, and handed it over to her dashing husband, who galloped off to camp bearing it upon his shoulder. Ord paid $40 for the table at which Lee sat, and afterwards presented it to Mrs. Grant, who modestly declined it and insisted that Mrs. Ord should become its possessor. General Sharp paid $10 for the pair of brass candlesticks. Colonel Sheridan, the general's brother, secured the stone inkstand, and General Capehart the chair in which Grant sat, which he gave not long before his death to Captain Wilman W. Blackmar of Boston. Captain O'Farrell of Hartford became the possessor of the chair in which Lee sat. A child's doll was found in the room, which the younger officers tossed from one to the other and called the Silent Witness. This toy was taken possession of by Colonel Moore of Sheridan's staff, and is now owned by his son. Bargains were at once struck for nearly all the articles in the room, and it is even said that some mementos were carried off for which no coin of the Republic was ever exchanged. The sofa remains in possession of Mrs. Spillman, Mr. McLean's daughter, who now lives in Camden, West Virginia. Colonel Marshall presented the boxwood inkstand to Mr. Blanchard of Baltimore. Of the 3 impressions of the terms of surrender made in General Grant's manifold writer, the first and third are believed to have been accidentally destroyed. No trace of them has since been discovered. The second is in the possession of the New York Commandery of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion, which purchased it recently from the widow of General Parker. The headquarters flag, which had been used throughout the entire Virginia campaign, General Grant presented to me. With his assent, I gave a portion of it to Colonel Babcock. It is a singular historical coincidence that McLean's former home was upon a Virginia farm near the battleground of the first Bull Run, and his house was used for a time as the headquarters of General Beauregard. When it was found that this fight was so popular that it was given an encore, and a second battle of Bull Run was fought the next year on the same ground, Mr. McLean became convinced that the place was altogether lacking in repose, and to avoid the active theater of war, he removed to the quiet village of Appomattox, only to find himself again surrounded by contending armies. Thus, the first and last scenes of the war drama in Virginia were enacted upon his property. Before General Grant had proceeded far toward camp, he was reminded that he had not yet announced the important event to the government. He dismounted by the roadside, sat down on a large stone, and called for pencil and paper. Colonel Badeau handed his order book to the general, who wrote on one of the leaves the following message, a copy of which was sent to the nearest telegraph station. It was dated 4:30 p.m. Honorable E. M. Stanton, Secretary of War, Washington. General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia this afternoon on terms proposed by myself. The accompanying additional correspondence will show the conditions fully. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. Upon reaching camp, he seated himself in front of his tent, notwithstanding the slight shower which was then falling, and we all gathered about him, curious to hear what his first comments would be upon the crowning event of his life. But our expectations were doomed to disappointment, for he appeared to have already dismissed the whole subject from his mind, and turning to the chief quartermaster, his first words were, "Ingalls, do you remember that old white mule that so-and-so used to ride when we were in the City of Mexico?" "Why, perfectly," said Ingalls, who was just then in a mood to remember the exact number of hairs in the mule's tail if it would have helped to make matters agreeable. And then the General-in-Chief went on to recall the antics played by that animal during an excursion to Popocatepetl. It was not until after dinner that he said much about the surrender, when he spoke freely of his entire belief that the rest of the Confederate commanders would follow Lee's example, and that we should have but little more fighting, even of a partisan nature. He then surprised us by announcing his intention of starting for Washington early the next morning. We were disappointed at this, for we wished to see something of the opposing army, now that it had become civil enough, for the first time in its existence, to let us get close up to it, and to meet some of the officers who had been acquaintances in former years. The General, however, had no desire to look at the conquered. Indeed, he had little curiosity in his nature, and he was anxious above all things to begin the reduction of the military establishment and diminish the enormous expense attending it, which at this time amounted to nearly $4 millions a day. When he considered, however, that the railroad was being rapidly put in condition as far as Burkeville, and that he would lose no time by waiting till noon of the next day, he made up his mind to delay his departure. About 9 o'clock on the morning of April 10, Grant with his staff rode out toward the enemy's lines, but it was found, upon attempting to pass through, that the force of habit is hard to overcome, and that the practice which had so long been inculcated in Lee's army of keeping Grant out of its lines was not to be overturned in a day, and he was politely requested at the picket lines to wait till a message could be sent to headquarters asking for instructions. As soon as Lee heard that his distinguished opponent was approaching, he was prompt to correct the misunderstanding at the picket line, and rode out at a gallop to receive him. They met on a knoll that overlooked the lines of the two armies, and saluted respectfully by each raising his hat. The officers present gave a similar salute, and then withdrew out of earshot, and grouped themselves about the two chieftains in a semicircle. General Grant repeated to us that evening the substance of the conversation, which was as follows. Grant began by expressing a hope that the war would soon be over, and Lee replied by stating that he had for some time been anxious to stop the further effusion of blood, and he trusted that everything would now be done to restore harmony and conciliate the people of the South. He said the emancipation of the Negroes would be no hindrance to the restoring of relations between the two sections of the country, as it would probably not be the desire of the majority of the Southern people to restore slavery then, even if the question were left open to them. He could not tell what the other armies would do, or what course Mr. Davis would now take, but he believed that it would be best for the other armies to follow his example, as nothing could be gained by further resistance in the field. Finding that he entertained these sentiments, General Grant told him that no one's influence in the South was so great as his, and suggested to him that he should advise the surrender of the remaining armies, and thus exert his influence in favor of immediate peace. Lee said he could not take such a course without first consulting President Davis. Grant then proposed to Lee that he should do so, and urge the hastening of a result which was admitted to be inevitable. Lee, however, in this instance was averse to stepping beyond his duties as a soldier, and said the authorities would doubtless soon arrive at the same conclusion without his interference. There was a statement put forth that Grant asked Lee to see Mr. Lincoln and talk with him as to the terms of Reconstruction, but this was erroneous. I asked General Grant about it when he was on his deathbed, and his recollection was distinct that he had made no such suggestion. I am of opinion that the mistake arose from hearing that Lee had been requested to go and see the President regarding peace, and thinking that this expression referred to Mr. Lincoln, whereas it referred to Mr. Davis. After the conversation had lasted a little more than half an hour, and Lee had requested that instructions be given to the officers left in charge to carry out the details of the surrender, that there might be no misunderstanding as to the form of paroles, the manner of turning over the property, etc., the conference ended. The two commanders lifted their hats and bade each other good-bye. Lee rode back to his camp to take a final farewell of his army, and Grant returned to McLean's house, where he sat on the porch until it was time to take his final departure. It will be observed that Grant at no time actually entered the enemy's lines. Ingalls, Sheridan, and Williams had asked permission to visit the enemy's lines and renew their acquaintance with some old friends, classmates, and former comrades in arms who were serving in Lee's army. They now returned, bringing with them General Cadmus M. Wilcox, who had been one of General Grant's groomsmen; Longstreet, who had also been at his wedding; Heth, who had been a subaltern with him in Mexico, besides Gordon, Pickett, and a number of others. They all stepped up to pay their respects to General Grant, who received them very cordially and talked frankly and pleasantly with them until it was time to leave. They manifested a deep appreciation of the terms which had been accorded to them in the Articles of Surrender, but several of them expressed some apprehension as to the civil processes which might ensue, and the measures which might be taken by the government as to confiscation of property and trial for treason. The hour of noon had now arrived, and General Grant, after shaking hands with all present who were not to accompany him, mounted his horse and started with his staff for Burkeville. Lee set out for Richmond, and it was felt by all that peace had at last dawned upon the land. The charges were now withdrawn from the guns, the campfires were left to smolder in their ashes, the horses were detached from the cannon to be hitched to the plow, and the Army of the Union and the Army of Northern Virginia turned their backs upon each other for the first time in 4 long bloody years. In this campaign, from March 29 to April 9, the Union loss was 1,316 killed, 7,750 wounded, and 1,714 prisoners, a total of 10,780. The enemy lost about 1,200 killed, 6,000 wounded, and 75,000 prisoners, including the capture at Appomattox. The repairers of the railroad had thought more of haste than of solidity of construction, and the special train bearing the General-in-Chief from Burkeville to City Point ran off the track 3 times. These mishaps caused much delay, and instead of reaching City Point that evening, he did not arrive until daylight the next morning, April 11. A telegram had been sent to Mrs. Grant, who had remained aboard the headquarters steamboat, telling her that we should get there in time for dinner, and she had prepared the best meal which the boat's larder could afford to help to celebrate the victory. She and Mrs. Rollins and Mrs. Morgan, who were with her, whiled away the long and anxious hours of the night by playing the piano, singing, and discussing the victory. But just before daylight the desire for sleep overcame them, and they lay down to take a nap. Soon after, our tired and hungry party arrived. The General went hurriedly aboard the boat and ran at once up the stairs to Mrs. Grant's stateroom. She was somewhat chagrined that she had not remained up to receive her husband, now more than ever her victor, but she had merely thrown herself upon the berth without undressing, and soon joined us all in the cabin, and extended to us enthusiastic greetings and congratulations. The belated dinner now served in good stead as a breakfast for our famished party. The General was asked whether he was going to run up to Richmond on the steamer and take a look at the captured city before starting for Washington. He replied, "No, I think it would be as well not to go. I could do no good there, and my visit might lead to demonstrations which would only wound the feelings of the residents, and we ought not to do anything at such a time which would add to their sorrow." And then added, "But if any of you have a curiosity to see the city, I will wait till you can take a trip there and back, for I cannot well leave here for Washington anyhow till tomorrow." Several of us put our horses aboard a boat and started up the James. As a portion of the river was supposed to be planted with torpedoes, we sat close to the stern, believing that in case of accident the bow would receive the main shock of the explosion. We reached the lower wharf of Richmond in safety, put our horses ashore, and rode about for an hour, looking at the city upon which we had laid covetous eyes for so many months. The evacuation had been accompanied by many acts of destruction, and the fire which our troops found blazing when they entered had left a third of the place smoldering in ashes. The white population were keeping closely to their houses, while the blacks were running wildly about the streets in every direction. Upon our return that evening to City Point, we found aboard the headquarters boat a clergyman, a member of the Christian Commission, who was personally acquainted with the general. He had called to see him to tender his congratulations, and during their conversation made the remark, "I have observed, General Grant, that a great many battles in our war have been fought on Sunday. Shiloh occurred on that day, the surrender of Donelson, Chancellorsville, the capture of Petersburg, the surrender at Appomattox, and I think some other important military events. How has this happened?" "It is quite true," replied the general. "Of course it was not intentional, and I think that sometimes perhaps it has been the result of the very efforts which have been made to avoid it. You see, a commander, when he can control his own movements, usually intends to start out early in the week so as not to bring on an engagement on Sunday, but delays occur often at the last moment, and it may be the middle of the week before he gets his troops in motion. Then more time is spent than anticipated in maneuvering for position, and when the fighting actually begins, it is the end of the week, and the battle, particularly if it continues a couple of days, runs into Sunday." "It is unfortunate," remarked the clergyman. "Yes, very unfortunate," observed the general. "Every effort should be made to respect the Sabbath day, and it is very gratifying to know that it is observed so generally throughout our country." It was always noticeable that he had a strict regard for the Sabbath, and this feeling continued through life. He never played a game of any kind on that day, nor wrote any official correspondence if he could help it. He had been brought up a Methodist, and regularly attended worship in the Methodist Episcopal Church, but he was entirely non-sectarian in his feelings. He had an intimate acquaintance among clergymen, and counted many of them among his closest friends. He rarely, if ever, spoke about his own religious convictions. It was one of those subjects not to be discussed lightly, and was so purely personal that he naturally shrank from dwelling upon it, for he always avoided talking upon any subject which was personal to himself. There was such a total lack of egotism in his nature that he could not see how anything touching his own personality could be of interest to others. He was imbued with a deep reverence, however, for all subjects of a religious nature, and nothing was more offensive to him than an attempt to make light of serious matters, or to show a disrespect for sacred things. His correspondence makes mention of his recognition of an overruling providence in all the affairs of this world, and in his speech to Mr. Lincoln accepting the commission of lieutenant general, he closed with the words, "I feel the full weight of the responsibilities now devolving on me, and I know that if they are met it will be due to those armies, and above all to the favor of that providence which leads both nations and men." He was always a liberal contributor to church work, and in fact to every good cause. His fault was that he was not sufficiently discriminating. Every mail brought begging letters, and he gave away sums out of all proportion to his means. When payday came, it took all the persuasions of those about him to prevent him from parting in this way with the greater part of his pay, his only source of revenue. Preparations were made to break up headquarters, and the next afternoon the party started by steamer for Washington, reached there the morning of the 13th, and took up their quarters at Willard's Hotel. It soon became noised about that the conqueror of the rebellion had arrived in the city, and dense crowds thronged the streets upon which the hotel fronted. During the forenoon, the general started for the War Department. His appearance in the street was a signal for an improvised reception in which shouts of welcome rent the air, and the populace joined in a demonstration which was thrilling in its earnestness. He had the greatest difficulty in making his way over even the short distance between the hotel and the department. At one time it was thought he would have to take to a carriage as a means of refuge, but by the interposition of the police he finally reached his destination. That afternoon the Secretary of War published an order stating that, after mature consideration and consultation with the Lieutenant General, it was decided to stop all drafting and recruiting, curtail the purchases of supplies, reduce the number of officers, and remove restrictions on commerce as far as consistent with public safety. This was a sort of public declaration of peace, and the city gave itself over to rejoicing. Bands were everywhere, heard playing triumphant strains, and crowds traversed the streets, shouting approval and singing patriotic airs. The general was the hero of the hour and the idol of the people. His name was on every lip, congratulations poured in upon him, and blessings were heaped upon him by all. General Grant visited the President and had a most pleasant interview with him. The next day, Friday, being a Cabinet day, he was invited to meet the Cabinet officers at their meeting in the forenoon. He went to the White House, receiving the cordial congratulations of all present, and discussed with them the further measures which should be taken for bringing hostilities to a speedy close. In this interview, Mr. Lincoln gave a singular manifestation of the effect produced upon him by dreams. When General Grant expressed some anxiety regarding the delay in getting news from Sherman, the President assured him that favorable news would soon be received, because he had had the night before his usual dream, which always preceded favorable tidings, the same dream which he had had the night before Antietam, Murfreesboro, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg. He seemed to be aboard a curious-looking vessel moving rapidly toward a dark and indefinite shore. This time, alas, the dream was not to be the precursor of good news. The President and Mrs. Lincoln invited the General and Mrs. Grant to go to Ford's Theater and occupy a box with them to see Our American Cousin. The General said he would be very sorry to have to decline, but that Mrs. Grant and he had made arrangements to go to Burlington, New Jersey, to see their children, and he feared it would be a great disappointment to his wife to delay the trip. The President remarked that the people would be so delighted to see the General that he ought to stay and attend the play on that account. The General, however, had been so completely besieged by the people since his arrival, and was so constantly the subject of outbursts of enthusiasm, that it had become a little embarrassing to him, and the mention of a demonstration in his honor at the theater did not appeal to him as an argument in favor of going. A note was now brought to him from Mrs. Grant, expressing increased anxiety to start for Burlington on the 4:00 train, and he told the President that he must decide definitely not to remain for the play. It was probably this declination which saved the General from assassination, as it was learned afterward that he had been marked for a victim. It was after 2:00 when he shook Mr. Lincoln's hand and said good-bye to him, little thinking that it would be an eternal farewell, and that an appalling tragedy was soon to separate them forever. Their final leave-taking was only 13 months after their first meeting, but during that time their names had been associated with enough momentous events to fill whole volumes of a nation's history. The General went at once to his rooms at the hotel. As soon as he entered, Mrs. Grant said to him, "When I went to my lunch today, a man with a wild look followed me into the dining-room, took a seat nearly opposite to me at the table, stared at me continually, and seemed to be listening to my conversation." The General replied, "Oh, I suppose he did so merely from curiosity." In fact, the General by this time had become so accustomed to having people stare at him, and the members of his family, that such acts had ceased to attract his attention. About 3:30, the wife of General Rucker called with her carriage to take the party to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad station. It was a two-seated top carriage. Mrs. Grant sat with Mrs. Rucker on the back seat. The General, with true Republican simplicity, sat on the front seat with the driver. Before they had gone far along Pennsylvania Avenue, a horseman who was riding in the same direction passed them, and as he did so, peered into the carriage. When Mrs. Grant caught sight of his face, she remarked to the General, "That is the same man who sat down at the lunch table near me. I don't like his looks." Before they reached the station, the horseman turned and rode back toward them, and again gazed at them intently. This time he attracted the attention of the general, who regarded the man's movements as singular, but made light of the matter so as to allay Mrs. Grant's apprehensions. On their arrival at the station, they were conducted to the private car of Mr. Garrett, then president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railway Company. Before the train reached Baltimore, a man appeared on the front platform of the car and tried to get in, but the conductor had locked the door so that the general would not be troubled by visitors, and the man did not succeed in entering. The general and Mrs. Grant drove across Philadelphia about midnight from the Broad Street and Washington Avenue station to the Walnut Street wharf on the Delaware River for the purpose of crossing the ferry and then taking the cars to Burlington. As the general had been detained so long at the White House that he was not able to get luncheon before starting, and as there was an additional ride in prospect, a stop was made at Bloodgood's Hotel near the ferry for the purpose of getting supper. The general had just taken his seat with Mrs. Grant at the table in the supper room when a telegram was brought in and handed to him. His whereabouts was known to the telegraph people from the fact that he had sent a message to Bloodgood's ordering the supper in advance. The general read the dispatch, dropped his head, and sat in perfect silence. Then came another and still another dispatch, but not a word was spoken. Mrs. Grant now broke the silence by saying, "Ulysses, what do the telegrams say? Do they bring any bad news?" "I will read them to you," the general replied in a voice which betrayed his emotion. "But first prepare yourself for the most painful and startling news that could be received, and control your feelings so as not to betray the nature of the dispatches to the servants." He then read to her the telegrams conveying the appalling announcement that Mr. Lincoln, Mr. Seward, and probably the Vice President, Mr. Johnston, had been assassinated, and warning the general to look out for his own safety. A special train was at once ordered to take him back to Washington, but finding that he could take Mrs. Grant to Burlington, less than an hour's ride, and return to Philadelphia nearly as soon as his train could be got ready, he continued on, took her to her destination, returned to Philadelphia, and was in Washington the next morning. It was found that the president had been shot and killed at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, that Mr. Seward had received severe but not fatal injuries at the hands of Payne, who attempted his assassination, but that no attack had been made on the vice president. When the likenesses of Booth appeared, they resembled so closely the mysterious man who had followed the general and Mrs. Grant on their way to the rail station at Washington that there remained no doubt that he had intended to be the president's assassin and was bent upon ascertaining the movements of the general-in-chief. An anonymous letter was afterward received by the general, saying that the writer had been designated by the conspirators to assassinate him and had been ordered by Booth to board the train and commit the deed there, that he had attempted to enter the special car for this purpose, but that it was locked and he was thus baffled, and that he thanked God that this circumstance had been the means of preventing him from staining his hands with the blood of so great and good a man. Washington, as well as the whole country, was plunged in an agony of grief, and the excitement knew no bounds. Stanton's grief was uncontrollable, and at the mention of Mr. Lincoln's name he would break down and weep bitterly. General Grant and the Secretary of War busied themselves day and night in pushing a relentless pursuit of the conspirators, who were caught and were brought to trial before a military commission, except Booth, who was shot in an attempt to capture him. John H. Surratt, who escaped from the country, was captured and tried years later, the jury disagreeing as to his guilt. I was appointed a member of the court which was to try the prisoners. The defense, however, raised the objection that as I was a member of General Grant's military family, and as it was claimed that he was one of the high officials who was an intended victim of the assassins, I was disqualified from sitting in judgment upon them. The court very properly sustained the objection, and I was relieved, and another officer was substituted. However, I sat one day at the trial, which was interesting from the fact that it afforded an opportunity of seeing the assassins and watching their actions before the court. The prisoners, heavily manacled, were marched into the courtroom in solemn procession, an armed sentinel accompanying each of them. The men's heads were covered with thickly padded hoods with openings for the mouth and nose. The hoods had been placed upon them in consequence of Powell, alias Payne, having attempted to cheat the gallows by dashing his brains out against a beam on a gunboat on which he had been confined. The prisoners, whose eyes were thus bandaged, were led to their seats, the sentinels were posted behind them, and the hoods were then removed. As the light struck their eyes, which for several days had been unaccustomed to its brilliancy, the sudden glare gave them great discomfort. Payne had a wild look in his wandering eyes, and his general appearance stamped him as the typical reckless desperado. Mrs. Surratt was placed in a chair at a little distance from the men. She sat most of the time leaning back with her feet stretched forward. She kept up a piteous moaning, and frequently called for water, which was given her. The other prisoners had a stolid look and seemed crushed by the situation. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. Sherman's terms to Joseph E. Johnston, the end of hostilities, the grand review at Washington, Grant's place in military history. As soon as the surrender at Appomattox had taken place, General Grant dispatched a boat from City Point with a message to Sherman announcing the event and telling him that he could offer the same terms to Johnston. On April 18, Sherman entered into an agreement with Johnston, which embraced political as well as merely military questions, but only conditionally, and with the understanding that the armistice granted could be terminated if the conditions were not approved by superior authority. A staff officer sent by General Sherman brought his communication to Washington announcing the terms of this agreement. It was received by General Grant on April 21. Perceiving that the terms covered many questions of a civil and not of a military nature, he suggested to the Secretary of War that the matter had better be referred at once to President Johnston and the Cabinet for their action. A Cabinet meeting was called before midnight, and there was a unanimous decision that the basis of agreement should be disapproved, and an order was issued directing General Grant to proceed in person to Sherman's headquarters and direct operations against the enemy. Instead of merely recognizing that Sherman had made an honest mistake in exceeding his authority, the President and the Secretary of War characterized his conduct as akin to treason, and the Secretary denounced him in unmeasured terms. At this, General Grant grew indignant and gave free expression to his opposition to an attempt to stigmatize an officer whose acts throughout all his career gave ample contradiction to the charge that he was actuated by unworthy motives. The form of the public announcement put forth by the War Department aroused great public indignation against Sherman, and it was some time before his motives were fully understood. Grant started at daybreak on the 22nd, proceeded at once to Raleigh, explained the situation and attitude of the government fully to Sherman, and directed him to give the required notice for annulling the truce and to demand a surrender of Johnston's army on the same terms as those accorded to Lee. Sherman was, as usual, perfectly loyal and subordinate, and made all haste to comply with these instructions. When he went out to the front to meet Johnston, Grant remained quietly at Raleigh, and throughout the negotiations kept himself entirely in the background, lest he might seem to share in the honor of receiving the surrender, the credit for which he wished to belong wholly to Sherman. The entire surrender of Johnston's forces was promptly concluded. Having had a talk with the Secretary of War soon after General Grant's departure, and finding him bent upon continuing the denunciation of Sherman before the public, I started for North Carolina to meet General Grant and inform him of the situation in Washington. I passed him, however, on the way, and at once returned and rejoined him at Washington. Hostilities were now brought rapidly to a close throughout the entire theater of war. April 11, Canby compelled the evacuation of Mobile. By the 21st, our troops had taken Selma, Tuscaloosa, Montgomery, West Point, Columbus, and Macon. May 4, Richard Taylor surrendered the Confederate forces east of the Mississippi. May 10, Jefferson Davis was captured, and on the 26th, Kirby Smith surrendered his command west of the Mississippi. Since April 8, 1,680 cannon had been captured, and 174,223 Confederate soldiers had been paroled. There was no longer a rebel in arms, the Union cause had triumphed, slavery was abolished, and the national government was again supreme. The Army of the Potomac, Sheridan's cavalry, and Sherman's army had all reached the capital by the end of May. Sheridan could not remain with his famous corps, for General Grant sent him post-haste to the Rio Grande to look after operations there in a contemplated movement against Maximilian's forces, who were upholding a monarchy in Mexico in violation of the Monroe Doctrine. It was decided that the troops assembled at Washington should be marched in review through the nation's capital before being mustered out of service. The Army of the Potomac, being senior in date of organization and having been for 4 years the more direct defense of the capital city, was given precedence, and May 23 was designated as the day on which it was to be reviewed. During the preceding 5 days, Washington had been given over to elaborate preparations for the coming pageant. The public buildings were decked with a tasteful array of bunting, flags were unfurled from private dwellings, arches and transparencies with patriotic mottos were displayed in every quarter, and the spring flowers were fashioned into garlands and played their part. The whole city was ready for the most imposing fête day in its history. Vast crowds of citizens had gathered from neighboring states. During the review, they filled the stands, lined the sidewalks, packed the porches, and covered even the housetops. The weather was superb. A commodious stand had been erected on Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House, on which were gathered a large number of distinguished officials, including the President, the members of his cabinet who had won renown in the cabinet of Lincoln, the acting Vice President, Justices of the Supreme Court, governors of states, senators and representatives, the General-in-Chief of the Army, and the Captor of Atlanta, with other generals of rank, admirals of the Navy, and brilliantly uniformed representatives of foreign powers. General Grant, accompanied by the principal members of his staff, was one of the earliest to arrive. With his customary simplicity and dislike of ostentation, he had come on foot through the White House grounds from the headquarters of the Army at the corner of 17th and F Streets. Grant's appearance was, as usual, the signal for a boisterous demonstration. Sherman arrived a few minutes later, and his reception was scarcely less enthusiastic. At 9 o'clock, the signal gun was fired, and the legions took up their march. They started from the Capitol and moved along Pennsylvania Avenue toward Georgetown. The width and location of that street made it an ideal thoroughfare for such a purpose. Martial music from scores of bands filled the air, and when familiar war songs were played, the spectators along the route joined in shouting the chorus. Those oftenest sung and most applauded were "When This Cruel War Is Over," "When Johnny Comes Marching Home," and "Tramp, tramp, tramp, the boys are marching." At the head of the column rode Meade, crowned with the laurels of 4 years of warfare. The plaudits of the multitude followed him along the entire line of march. Flowers were thrown in his path, and garlands decked his person and his horse. He dismounted after having passed the reviewing stand, stepped upon the platform, and was enthusiastically greeted by all present. Then came the cavalry, with the gallant Merritt at their head, commanding in the absence of Sheridan. The public were not slow to make recognition of the fame he had won on so many hard-fought fields. Conspicuous among the division commanders was Custer. His long golden locks floated in the wind, his low-cut collar, his crimson necktie, and his buckskin breeches presented a combination which made him look half general and half scout, and gave him a daredevil appearance which singled him out for general remark and applause. When within 200 yards of the President's stand, his spirited horse took the bit in his teeth and made a dash past the troops, rushing by the reviewing officers like a tornado. But he found more than a match in Custer, and was soon checked and forced back to his proper position. When the cavalrymen, covered with flowers, afterward rode by the reviewing officials, the people screamed with delight. After the cavalry came Parke, who might well feel proud of the prowess of the Ninth Corps, which followed him. Then Griffin, riding at the head of the gallant Fifth Corps. Then Humphreys and the Second Corps, of unexcelled valor. Wright's Sixth Corps was greatly missed from the list, but its duties kept it in Virginia, and it was accorded a special review on June 8. The men preserved their alignment and distances with an ease which showed their years of training in the field. Their movements were unfettered, their step was elastic, and the swaying of their bodies and the swinging of their arms were as measured as the vibrations of a pendulum. Their muskets shone like a wall of steel. The cannon rumbled peacefully over the paved street, banks of flowers almost concealing them. Nothing touched the hearts of the spectators so deeply as the sight of the old war flags as they were carried by, those precious standards, bullet-riddled, battle-stained, many of them but remnants, often with not enough left of them to show the names of the battles they had seen. Some were decked with ribbons, and some festooned with garlands. Everybody was thrilled by the sight. Eyes were dimmed with tears of gladness, and many of the people broke through all restraint, rushed into the street, and pressed their lips upon the folds of the standards. The President was kept busy doffing his hat. He had a way of holding it by the brim with his right hand and waving it from left to right, and occasionally passing his right arm across his breast and resting the hat on his left shoulder. This manual of the hat was original, and had probably been practiced with good effect when its wearer was stumping East Tennessee. As each commander in turn passed the reviewing stand, he dismounted and came upon the platform, where he paid his respects to the President, was presented to the guests, and remained during the passage of his command. A prominent officer of the Engineer Brigade, while riding by, led to a slight commotion on the platform. He wore a French chasseur cap, which he had made of a pattern differing from the strict regulation headgear in having an extra amount of cloth between the lower band and the crown. As he came opposite the President and raised his sword in saluting, he paid an additional mark of respect by bowing his head. At the same moment, the horse, as if catching the spirit of its rider, kicked up behind and put down its head. This unexpected participation of the horse in the salute sent the officer's head still lower, and the crown of his cap fell forward, letting out the superfluous cloth till it looked like an accordion extended at full length. The sight was so ludicrous that several of us who were standing just behind the President burst out into a poorly suppressed laugh. This moved him to turn squarely round and glare at us savagely in an attempt to frown down such a lack of dignity before, or rather behind, the chief magistrate of the nation. For nearly 7 hours the pageant was watched with unabated interest, and when it had faded from view, the spectators were eager for the night to pass, so that on the morrow the scene might be renewed in the marching of the mighty Army of the West. The next day the same persons, with a few exceptions, assembled upon the reviewing stand. At 9 o'clock Sherman's veterans started. Howard had been relieved of the command of the Army of the Tennessee to take charge of the Freedmen's Bureau, and instead of leading his old troops, he rode with Sherman at the head of the column, his armless right sleeve giving evidence of his heroism in action. Sherman, unknown by sight to most of the people in the East, was eagerly watched for, and his appearance awoke great enthusiasm. His tall, spare figure, war-worn face, and martial bearing made him all that the people had pictured him. He had ridden but a little way before his body was decorated with flowery wreaths, and his horse enveloped in garlands. As he approached the reviewing stand, the bands struck up "Marching Through Georgia," and played that stirring air with a will. This was the signal for renewed demonstrations of delight. When he had passed, he turned his horse into the White House grounds, dismounted, and strode rapidly to the platform. He advanced to where the President was standing, and the two shook hands. The members of the Cabinet then stepped up to greet him. He took their extended hands and had a few pleasant words to say to each of them until Stanton reached out his hand. Then Sherman's whole manner changed in an instant. A cloud of anger overspread his features, and smarting under the wrong the Secretary had done him in his published bulletins after the conditional treaty with Johnston, the General turned abruptly away. This rebuff became the sensation of the day. There was no personal intercourse between the two men till some time afterward, when General Grant appeared as usual in the role of peacemaker, and brought them together. Sherman showed a manly spirit of forgiveness in going to see Stanton in his last illness, manifesting his respect and tendering his sympathy. Sherman's active mind was crowded with the remembrance of past events, and he spent all the day in pointing out the different subdivisions of his army as they moved by, and recalling in his pithy and graphic way many of the incidents of the stirring campaigns through which they had passed. Logan, Blackjack, came riding at the head of the Army of the Tennessee, his swarthy features and long coal-black hair giving him the air of a native Indian chief. The Army Corps which led the column was the 15th, commanded by Hazen. Then came the 17th under Frank P. Blair. Now Slocum appeared at the head of the Army of Georgia, consisting of the 20th Corps, headed by the gallant Mower, with his bushy whiskers covering his face and looking the picture of a hard fighter, and the 14th Corps, headed by Jefferson C. Davis. Each division was preceded by a pioneer corps of Negroes, marching in double ranks, with picks, spades, and axes slung across their brawny shoulders, their stalwart forms conspicuous by their height. But the impedimenta were the novel feature of the march. 6 ambulances followed each division to represent its baggage train, and then came the amusing spectacle of Sherman's bummers, bearing with them the spoils of war. The bummers were men who were the forerunners, flankers, and foragers of the army. Each one was often his own commanding officer. If a bummer was too short-sighted to see the enemy, he would go nearer. If he was lame, he would make it an excuse to disobey an order to retreat. If out of reach of supplies, he would wear his clothes till there was not enough of his coat left to wad a gun, and not enough of his shirt to flag a train. He was always last in a retreat and first in an enemy's smokehouse. In kindling his campfire, he would obey the general order to take only the top rail of the neighboring fences, but would keep on taking the top rail till there were none of the fences left. The trophies of his foraging expeditions, which appeared in the review, consisted of pack mules loaded with turkeys, geese, chickens, and bacon, and here and there a chicken coop strapped on to the saddle with a cackling brood peering out through the slats. Then came cows, goats, sheep, donkeys, crowing roosters, and in one instance a chattering monkey. Mixed with these was a procession of fugitive blacks, old men, stalwart women, and grinning pickaninnies of all sizes, and ranging in color from a raven's wing to a new saddle. This portion of the column called forth shouts of laughter and continuous rounds of applause. Flowers were showered upon the troops in the same profusion as the day before, and there was no abatement of the uncontrollable enthusiasm of the vast assemblage of citizens who witnessed the march. Comparisons were naturally instituted between the Eastern and Western armies. The difference was much less than has been represented. The Army of the Potomac presented a somewhat neater appearance in dress and was a little more precise in its movements. Sherman's army showed perhaps more of a rough and ready aspect and a devil-may-care spirit. Both were in the highest degree soldierly and typical representatives of the terrible realism of relentless war. At 3:30 the matchless pageant had ceased. For 2 whole days a nation's heroes had been passing in review. Greeted with bands playing, drums beating, bells ringing, banners flying, kerchiefs waving, and voices cheering, they had made their last march. Even after every veteran had vanished from sight, the crowds kept their places for a time, as if still under a spell, and unwilling to believe that the marvelous spectacle had actually passed from view. It was not a Roman triumph, designed to gratify the vanity of the victors, exhibit their trophies, and parade their enchained captives before the multitude. It was a celebration of the dawn of peace, a declaration of the reestablishment of the Union. General Grant now stood in the front rank of the world's greatest captains. He had conquered the most formidable rebellion in the annals of history. The armies under his immediate direction in Virginia had captured 75,000 prisoners and 689 cannon. The armies under his general command had captured in April and May 147,000 prisoners and 997 cannon, making a total of 222,000 prisoners and 1,680 cannon as the achievement of the forces he controlled. Footnote: these figures relate to the final campaign alone. The whole year's capture were, of course, much larger. Editor. End note. Most of the conspicuous soldiers in history have risen to prominence by gradual steps, but the Union commander came before the people with a sudden bound. Almost the first sight they caught of him was at Donelson. From that event to the closing triumph of Appomattox, he was the leader whose name was the harbinger of victory. He was unquestionably the most aggressive fighter in the entire list of the world's famous soldiers. He never once yielded up a stronghold he had wrested from his foe. He kept his pledge religiously to take no backward steps. For 4 years of bloody and relentless war, he went steadily forward, replacing the banner of his country upon the territory where it had been hauled down. He possessed in a striking degree every characteristic of the successful soldier. His methods were all stamped with tenacity of purpose, originality, and ingenuity. He depended for his success more upon the powers of invention than of adaptation, and the fact that he has been compared at different times to nearly every great commander in history is perhaps the best proof that he was like none of them. He realized that in a sparsely settled country with formidable natural obstacles and poor roads, and in view of the improvement in range and rapidity of fire in cannon and small arms, the European methods of warfare and the rules laid down in many of the books must be abandoned, and new means devised to meet the change in circumstances. He therefore adopted a more open order of battle, made an extensive use of skirmish lines, employed cavalry largely as mounted infantry, and sought to cultivate the individuality of the soldier instead of making him merely an unthinking part of a compact machine. He originated the cutting loose from the base of supplies with large armies and living off the invaded country. He insisted constantly upon thorough cooperation between the different commands, and always aimed to prevent operations of corps or armies which were not part of a joint movement in obedience to a comprehensive plan. His marvelous combinations, covering half a continent, soon wrought the destruction of the Confederacy, and when he struck Lee the final blow, the cooperating armies were so placed that there was no escape for the opposing forces, and within 47 days thereafter, every Confederate army surrendered to a Union army. He had no hobby as to the use of any particular arm of the service. He naturally placed his main reliance in his infantry, but made a more vigorous use of cavalry than any of the generals of his day, and was judicious in regulating the amount of his artillery by the character of the country in which he was operating. His magnanimity to Lee, his consideration for his feelings, and the generous terms granted him served as a precedent for the subsequent surrenders and had much to do with the bringing about a prompt and absolute cessation of hostilities, thus saving the country from a prolonged guerrilla warfare. He was possessed of a moral and physical courage which was equal to every emergency in which he was placed. He was calm amid excitement, patient under trials, sure in judgment, clear in foresight, never depressed by reverses or unduly elated by success. He was fruitful in expedients, and had a facility of resource and a faculty of adapting the means at hand to the accomplishment of an end which never failed him. He possessed an intuitive knowledge of topography which prevented him from ever becoming confused as to locality or direction in conducting even the most complicated movements in the field. His singular self-reliance enabled him at critical junctures to decide instantly questions of vital moment without dangerous delay in seeking advice from others, and to assume the gravest responsibilities without asking anyone to share them. His habits of life were simple, and he enjoyed a physical constitution which enabled him to endure every form of fatigue and privation incident to military service in the field. His soldiers always knew that he was ready to rough it with them and share their hardships on the march. He wore no better clothes than they, and often ate no better food. There was nothing in his manner to suggest that there was any gulf between him and the men who were winning his victories. He never tired of giving unstinted praise to his subordinates. He was at all times loyal to them. His fidelity produced a reciprocal effect, and is one of the chief reasons why they became so loyally attached to him. He was never betrayed by success into boasting of his triumphs. He never underrated himself in a battle. He never overrated himself in a report. General Sheridan, in his memoirs, says of his chief in speaking of the later campaigns, the effect of his discomfitures was to make him all the more determined to discharge successfully the stupendous trust committed to his care, and to bring into play the manifold resources of his well-ordered mind. He guided every subordinate then, and in the last days of the rebellion, with a fund of common sense and a superiority of intellect which have left an impress so distinct as to exhibit his great personality. When his military history is analyzed after the lapse of years, it will show even more clearly than now that during these as well as his previous campaigns he was the steadfast center about and on which everything else turned. General Longstreet, one of his most persistent foes on the field of battle, says in his reminiscences, General Grant had come to be known as an all-around fighter, seldom if ever surpassed, but the biggest part of him was his heart. And again, as the world continues to look at and study the grand combinations and strategy of General Grant, the higher will be his reward as a soldier. While his achievements in actual battle eclipse by their brilliancy the strategy and grand tactics employed in his campaigns, yet the extraordinary combinations effected and the skill and boldness exhibited in moving large armies into position should entitle him to as much credit as the qualities he displayed in the immediate presence of the enemy. With him, the formidable game of war was in the hands of a master. End of chapter 32. End of Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter.